It had been a long day of driving, the kind of relentless summer heat that made the asphalt shimmer like a mirage and fried your nerves long before it fried the car's engine. I was on a cross-country trip, the kind where you tell yourself you're finding yourself while mostly just trying to keep your sanity between the interstate exits. I had left Chicago early in the morning and was aiming to reach St. Louis by evening. The plan was simple: drive until exhaustion hit, pull over, find a cheap motel, sleep, and start again at dawn. But things never quite stick to the simple plan when you're on the road alone. I had been on I-55 for hours, the sun dipping lower and casting long orange shadows across the trees lining the highway. There was a stretch where the exits thinned out, the road flanked by nothing but cornfields and the occasional abandoned farmhouse. I noticed a small, flickering neon sign off a barely visible turnoff: High Pines Motel. The red letters were warped and half burnt out, the kind of sign that screamed cheap vacancy. I hesitated for a moment. Something about it seemed off, but I was tired and I needed a room. The motel was smaller than I imagined, a single long building with peeling white paint and a low roof sagging in the middle. The parking lot had maybe 6 cars, all older models, and one of the windows had a curtain flapping violently despite the still air. I shrugged it off as just bad maintenance and drove up to the office. The door creaked like it hadn't been oiled in decades. Inside, the lobby was dim, a single overhead bulb swinging slightly. The air smelled like stale cigarette smoke and mildew. Behind the counter sat an older man, probably in his late 60s, balding, wearing a plaid shirt that looked like it hadn't been washed in a week. He gave me a look that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't unfriendly, but there was an intensity to it, like he was studying me for some hidden reason. "Room for the night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded slowly. "Single?" "Yeah." He typed something into an ancient computer that whirred and groaned, then handed me a key with a small, dented metal tag. "Room 7, second floor. Elevator's broken. Take the stairs." I nodded, paid him, and headed out. The stairs were old, the wood creaking under my weight. Room 7 was at the end of the hall. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach, mixed with something I couldn't identify, almost metallic. When I opened the door, I immediately noticed the room was smaller than expected. A single bed, a worn armchair, a tiny bathroom, and a dresser with a cracked mirror. The first thing I did was check the windows. They were thick, the kind that rattled when the wind blew, and one corner of the glass had a strange smudge that looked like a fingerprint smeared downward. I couldn't tell if it was old or fresh. I set my bag down and turned on the TV. Static, no signal. I sighed, deciding I'd just charge my phone and try to sleep. Around 10:30, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A soft thump coming from the room next door. I froze. The sound was rhythmic, almost like someone was pacing. I reminded myself it was a motel. People check in and out at all hours, maybe just some restless guest. But the noise didn't stop. Thump, thump, thump. Slow, deliberate. It was like footsteps walking toward the shared wall. I considered calling the front desk, but a nagging unease told me not to. I lay in bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then I heard a whisper. Faint, almost indiscernible. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound came again from the vent above the bathroom, a low, hoarse whisper, syllables I couldn't make out. My heart started to race. I switched on the bedside lamp, trying to illuminate the corners of the room. Everything was normal, just a bed, a chair, and the dresser. But the whispering persisted, soft and distorted, like it was bouncing around the walls. I got up, grabbing my phone for light, and cautiously approached the vent. I crouched down, listening. Nothing. The whisper stopped the moment I got close. I leaned back, relieved, until I noticed movement in the cracked mirror on the dresser. At first, I thought it was a trick of the reflection, but then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing behind me. No features, just a dark silhouette. I spun around. Nothing. I stumbled back, heart pounding, trying to rationalize it. Maybe exhaustion, maybe stress from driving, maybe the shadows playing tricks under the dim light. I tried to calm myself, telling myself to breathe, that nothing could happen here. Around midnight, I heard it again, but louder this time. A knock on the door, not a polite hotel knock, but a deliberate, heavy, insistent knocking. I froze. My phone was in my hand, ready to call the desk, but I couldn't bring myself to. The knocking grew faster, harder. Then a voice whispering my name. Please, let me in. I bolted to the door, heart hammering. I looked through the peephole. Nothing. No one outside. The parking lot was empty except for my car. My first thought was a prank, but it didn't make sense. This was a rural highway, hours from the nearest town. I backed away from the door and noticed the window again. The smudge was now smeared upward, like something had pressed against it from the outside. The air grew colder suddenly, icy against my skin, and the whispering returned, louder, more urgent. I could make out words now, though garbled. Don't sleep here. Panic set in. I grabbed my bag, considering leaving immediately, but the hallway stairs creaked under the weight of something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing outside my room. My instincts screamed at me to hide. I slid the dresser in front of the door, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Minutes passed. Silence. I thought I was safe. Then the whispering right next to my ear. I see you. I spun around. Empty. My breathing was loud in the confined room. I debated whether to run out into the parking lot. I had no idea what I would do if someone or something was out there. I called the front desk. Static. Then the man's voice, calm but distant. Room 7. Everything okay? I explained the noises, the knocking, the whispering. He was silent for a moment, then chuckled softly. Ah, you found her. She likes the new guests. Found who? I asked, panic rising. There was a long pause. Then, don't worry, she won't hurt you if you leave before morning. Before I could ask more, the line went dead. I checked the number. The office line showed no connection, like it had been disconnected for decades. I realized I had to leave. I grabbed my keys and ran down the hallway, stepping over a dark stain that hadn't been there before. The door at the end of the hall led outside. I ran to my car, not looking back. The engine roared to life, and I sped onto the highway. The neon sign flickered behind me. High Pines Motel. I glanced in the rearview mirror. I could swear I saw a figure standing in the window of room 7, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I reached a large gas station in a town miles away. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't explain what had happened. I told the attendant I just needed coffee, anything to calm down. But every time I looked out the window, I felt like I was being watched, like shadows were stretching along the highway, waiting. I never stayed at another roadside motel alone. But I still drive that route occasionally. Sometimes, when the sun sets and the fields stretch endlessly, I think about High Pines. And sometimes, I think I see that flickering red sign in the distance, even when I know it shouldn't be there. The stories online about that stretch of highway talk about abandoned motels and missing travelers. Some say High Pines had been closed for years. Others say the old owner died under mysterious circumstances. No one knows for sure, but I do. And I'll never forget the whisper, the knock, or the eyes that watched me from room 7 that night. I don't know who or what was there, but I know it wanted me to leave, and I did. But the memory that has followed me ever since. Even now, when I hear a distant thump at night or a soft whisper that sounds too close to my ear, I think of that motel, and I know some doors should never be opened. Story the end. I was driving late one Thursday night, heading south through Missouri, alone in my old sedan. The sky was overcast, and the rain had started falling lightly, slicking the asphalt and making the highway shimmer under the dim streetlights. I'd been on the road for nearly 10 hours, trying to make it to a small town called Willow Creek before morning. My eyelids were heavy, the kind of fatigue where you feel your brain start to short-circuit between consciousness and sleep. I knew I needed to stop soon. The highway had been quiet for miles, nothing but cornfields stretching to the horizon, and then I saw it. A small flickering sign half hidden behind some trees. It read, Maple Grove Motel, in red neon letters that buzzed faintly. The edges of the letters were burnt out, and the whole sign leaned slightly, as if it were about to collapse. My gut told me to keep driving, but exhaustion and the cold rain made my decision for me. I needed a room, no matter how sketchy. Pulling into the gravel lot, I noticed the motel looked older than the sign suggested. The paint on the building was peeling, and the lights in the parking lot flickered sporadically. Only a couple of cars were parked outside, both covered in a fine layer of dust. I parked near the office, which was just a small shack with a single flickering porch light. Inside, the lobby smelled like damp carpet mixed with cigarette smoke and something faintly metallic. Behind the counter sat a man, maybe in his 70s, with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose. His eyes seemed too sharp for his age, almost predatory in the way they studied me. "Room for the night?" I asked. He nodded slowly, fingers drumming on the counter. "Single?" "Yeah." He shuffled a set of keys and handed me a brass key with a small paper tag. "Room 9, upstairs. Don't mind the stairs, they've seen better days." I thanked him and made my way to the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, echoing in the empty hallway. The paint on the walls was faded, and a faint streak of brownish stains ran down the corners near the ceiling. I pushed open the door to room 9. The smell hit me immediately. Damp, moldy, with a hint of something iron-like. The bed was neatly made, but the sheets had a slight yellow tinge. A dresser with a cracked mirror sat against the wall, and the carpet was thin and threadbare. I set my bag down, planning to take a quick shower and get some sleep. As I turned on the bathroom light, I noticed something strange. A single wet handprint on the mirror, smudged downward as if someone had been pressed against it. I frowned, wiped it off, and tried to shrug it off. Maybe housekeeping had missed it. After the shower, I climbed into bed. Sleep was slow to come, the old mattress squeaking under me. Around 11:15, I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails against wood, coming from the ceiling. I froze. It stopped after a few seconds, but then it returned, faster this time, like something pacing. My heart rate quickened. I got up and checked the room, moving cautiously. The bathroom and closet were empty. I approached the window. Outside, the rain was falling steadily, and the parking lot was deserted. I looked back at the room, and that's when I saw movement in the dresser mirror. Something dark, low to the ground, scuttling along the edge of the reflection. I spun around. Nothing. I laughed nervously, blaming exhaustion. I sat back down, trying to steady my breathing. Then I heard it. A soft whisper right beside my ear. "Don't sleep." I froze. My body felt frozen in place, every instinct screaming to run. The whisper repeated, more urgent this time, almost pleading, "Leave. Now." I bolted to the door, but the hallway outside was empty. I tried the stairs, solid, but with that same unsettling creak, as if something heavy was pacing above me. I ran down to the lobby, but it was empty. No sign of the old man, no sound except the hum of a flickering light. I grabbed my keys and ran to the car, sliding into the driver's seat. The engine turned over, and I peeled out of the lot, the neon sign flickering violently behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, watching me. A woman, I thought, though her features were blurred, almost shadowy, her hair dark and long, her dress damp and clinging. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, staring. I didn't slow down until I reached a highway gas station miles away. Inside, I tried to calm down, drinking coffee and telling myself it was a dream, a hallucination from exhaustion. But the image of her eyes, empty, yet somehow knowing, stayed with me. Later, I did some research. Maple Grove Motel had a history. Built in the 1960s, it was the site of a series of disappearances, mostly travelers passing through late at night. People reported strange noises, figures appearing in mirrors, whispers, calling their names. The motel was supposedly closed for over a decade, yet somehow the sign still flickered, the rooms still rented. I don't drive that stretch anymore, but sometimes when I hear about lonely motels on the highway or see a flickering sign in the distance at night, I remember the whisper, the figure in the mirror, and the way the air turned icy cold as if warning me, some places on the road aren't meant for anyone to stay. Story the end. It was one of those late summer nights when the highway seemed endless, a ribbon of black asphalt cutting through the countryside with nothing but the occasional flickering sign for guidance. I had been driving all day from Denver to a small town in western Kansas for work, a shift that involved inspecting grain silos and reporting back to the regional office. The GPS insisted I would reach my destination by midnight, but as the sun dipped below the horizon and the road stretched empty in front of me, I realized that I was running low on gas. My car's dashboard light blinked, a weak pulse against the growing darkness, and I knew I needed to find somewhere to stop before I ran into serious trouble. It was then that I saw it, a small motel, the kind that looks like it was dropped there in the 1960s and forgotten. Its sign, lit by a single flickering bulb, read Sunset Motel. The neon letters buzzed intermittently, and one of the bulbs was completely out, leaving the S in sunset dark. I slowed down and pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching against the loose stones. There were no other cars. Nothing moved. It was quiet, too quiet. But at that moment, I didn't care. I just needed a room for the night. The office was a small wooden structure at the front of the lot with a sliding glass window and a bell that I had to jingle to get attention. A man appeared after a moment, thin and older than I expected, wearing a stained polo shirt and khaki pants. His hair was gray, slicked back, and his eyes had that blank, empty stare that made me hesitate for a second. "Evening," I said. "Do you have a room?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, $50. Cash or card?" "Card," I said, fishing my wallet out. I noticed his hands shaking slightly as he swiped it through the reader. "Room 3, he said, handing me a key with a faded yellow tag. "Top floor. Don't mind the stairs. They're a little squeaky." I thanked him and walked to my car, dragging my suitcase behind me. The staircase creaked under each step, the sound echoing down the empty hallway. The room itself was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling at the corners and the carpet threadbare and stained. I set my suitcase down and turned on the light. The lamp flickered a few times before stabilizing, casting a weak glow across the room. I was tired and the day had been long, so I decided to shower and get some rest. That's when I noticed it, the smell. A faint, metallic odor that lingered in the corners, almost imperceptible at first. I shook it off, assuming it was just the plumbing or old building smell. The shower ran okay, though the water pressure was weak, and the room felt colder than it should have been for August. I tried to sleep, but the thin walls carried sounds from somewhere, though I couldn't figure out from where. At first, it was subtle, a scratching, like fingernails on wood, and then faint whispers. I sat up in bed, heart racing, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. I opened the window slightly to let in some fresh air, but the hallway was completely silent. Around 2 a.m., the television turned on by itself. The static was deafening, the flicker of black and white dots reflected in the mirror across from the bed. I froze, listening. The whispers were louder now, coming from the vent above the bed. I didn't know what compelled me, but I opened the vent cover. There was nothing but darkness, a long tube that disappeared into the walls. I closed it quickly and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady my breathing. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my door. I assumed it was the manager, checking on me. I'm here," I called out, my voice shaking. The steps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I reached for my phone. No signal. Nothing. My heart pounded in my chest. I considered leaving, but the thought of walking back to the highway in the dead of night with no light, no phone, made me hesitate. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. When I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, I dreamed of a woman. She was standing at the foot of my bed, her face pale and smeared with dark streaks, eyes black and empty. She didn't speak, but I felt her gaze piercing through me. I woke up with a start, my body drenched in sweat. The room was empty, silent. But on the floor near the dresser was a small puddle of water. Not from the sink, not from the shower. I stepped closer and saw that it formed a crude outline of a hand. My rational mind told me it was just condensation, maybe a leak, but I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine. I tried to call the office again. No answer. The bell didn't work. I considered banging on the door, but something in me stopped. I sat on the bed, staring at the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed thicker, darker, moving slightly, like smoke curling without wind. It wasn't until morning that I ventured out. The sunlight streaming through the windows revealed dust motes floating lazily in the air, but nothing else had changed. I went to the office to check out, but the man wasn't there. The sliding glass window was locked, and there was no sign of anyone. I walked back to my car, feeling foolish, but ready to leave this place behind. The engine turned over, and I drove away, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. But as I merged onto the highway, I saw it in my rearview mirror. The motel, empty as before, yet a single light flickered in the top floor window. I shook my head. It had to be a reflection. It had to be. I didn't notice the hitchhiker until I passed the next exit. He was a man, maybe my age, thumb out, standing under a streetlight. I slowed, my stomach knotting. The light revealed his face, pale, gaunt, eyes black and empty, and the exact same expression as the woman from my dream. I slammed the accelerator, passing him, my heart hammering. When I glanced back in the mirror, he was gone. The road stretched on, empty, but every mile felt heavier than the last. I tried calling the office from a gas station a few towns over, telling them I had to drive straight through. No answer. 3 days later, I looked up the Sunset Motel online, thinking maybe I had imagined it all. There was nothing. No records, no reviews, nothing on Google Maps or any travel site. The highway had a few motels, sure, but none with that name, none matching the description. I called a local historian who specialized in ghost towns along Old Route 40, and he hesitated before speaking. There was a motel like that back in the 60s, he said finally. Burned down, no survivors. Some say the land's haunted. People who stay too long never leave. I felt my stomach drop. Every detail, the smell, the flickering lights, the whispers, the shadow in the corner, snapped into place. I hadn't imagined it. I had driven past something that wasn't meant to exist anymore, something that lingered between the living and the dead. Since then, I've avoided that stretch of highway entirely. But every time I hear a story of a late-night motel or a ghostly hitchhiker on the side of a rural road, I can't help but shiver. Because I know what's out there, waiting for someone tired, lost, and desperate enough to stop. Waiting to make them part of the motel's story, trapped in a place that isn't meant for the living. I still wake up sometimes, drenched in sweat, hearing footsteps in my apartment that stop when I sit up. Shadows flicker at the edges of my vision, vanishing when I turn to look. I tell myself it's stress, that it's just memories, but deep down, I know the motel is still out there. And somewhere, in some dark corner of that empty lot, the manager still waits, smiling with blank, empty eyes, ready for the next weary traveler. I've told this story only to a few friends, and even then they laughed, told me I was imagining things. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. And I know that if you drive late at night and you see a motel with a flickering neon sign, you should keep driving. Because some places aren't meant for anyone to check in, and once you do, they don't let you go. Even now, writing this, I feel that pull, like I left a piece of myself there, in that peeling room with the thin carpet and the flickering lamp. I'll never know what might have happened if I had stayed longer, but I know the fear that clung to me, that suffocating sense that I was not alone, was real. And I know somewhere, the shadows that watched me from the corner still linger, waiting for someone else to wander in. And so I drive carefully now, avoiding back roads, avoiding the unknown, because the Sunset Motel, or whatever it is, was real. And it waits for the night, for the tired, the lost, the wandering souls who think they just need a room for the night. I know I was lucky to leave when I did. Some aren't. Story the end. It was after midnight when I first pulled into the parking lot of the Windward Motel. The rain had started up again, relentless and unyielding, bouncing off the asphalt in a staccato that made my windshield wipers struggle to keep up. I was exhausted. My drive from Kansas City to the outskirts of rural Missouri taking longer than I had anticipated. My phone had died miles back, leaving me dependent on the neon glow of the motel sign, which flickered intermittently like it had one foot in the grave. I hesitated, the eerie emptiness of the lot pressing in on me. Only a single car was parked near the office, an old Buick with frost on the windshield despite it being mid-August. I shrugged and unlocked my door, stepping into the damp air. Inside, the lobby smelled of bleach, old carpet, and something faintly metallic that made the back of my throat tighten. The front desk clerk was a thin man, probably in his late 50s, hunched over a register that looked decades old. His eyes were pale, almost gray, and they followed me with an intensity that made me instantly uncomfortable. "Room?" he croaked, his voice dry as sandpaper. "Yes," I replied, trying not to let my unease show. "Just for the night." He nodded slowly, sliding a brass key across the counter. 32, end of the hall. Don't open the door to anyone you don't know. The corridors, they can get confusing." I smiled politely, pretending not to shiver, and took the key. As I walked down the hall, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered sporadically, casting long, twitching shadows on the stained carpet. The room itself was nothing special. Small, with peeling wallpaper and a window that rattled in the wind, but it was dry and warm. I dropped my bag on the floor and went to shut the door, noticing for the first time that the lock clicked oddly, like it wasn't meant to be used. The first thing that caught my attention that night was the sound. It started low, almost imperceptible, like whispering or the scratching of fingernails across a wooden surface. I paused, listening. The sound seemed to come from the vent above the bed, or maybe from behind the walls themselves. My rational brain told me it was just the building settling, old plumbing, maybe rats in the ceiling. But something in the air felt off, like the room was holding its breath. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. The whispering. Sometimes a single word that I couldn't make out. Sometimes what sounded like someone dragging their feet across the hall outside my door. At one point, I thought I heard a knock. I froze, heart pounding. Then it came again, a soft, deliberate rapping, not like the usual knocks of people passing by. I didn't answer. I didn't move. Eventually it stopped. At around 3 in the morning, I woke to the feeling of being watched. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward me. That's when I saw it, just for a second, in the mirror across from the bed. A figure, hunched and thin, with eyes like pale coals, standing in the corner behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just the room, empty and quiet. I told myself I was imagining things, exhaustion playing tricks on me, but the unease didn't fade. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. The clerk was at the desk, as pale and rigid as the night before. "Good morning," I said. "Quiet night?" He didn't answer immediately, just stared at me, then finally muttered, "You saw it, didn't you?" I don't know what you mean." My stomach tightened. "Down the hall, room 28, the walls remember." I nodded, uncertain if I should press him further. I had no idea what he meant, and truthfully, I didn't want to know. I spent the day driving around the countryside, hoping to forget the motel entirely, but as night fell, the roads became empty, and the weather turned sour again. I was tired, and the storm made it impossible to find anything else. I reluctantly returned to the Windward Motel. When I entered the lobby, it was even emptier than the night before. The clerk wasn't at the desk. I called out, but only the echo of my voice returned. I walked toward the hall and noticed the doors, 32, 28, 26, all slightly ajar, even though I was certain I had locked my room. I hesitated, but exhaustion overruled my fear. I went to my room. As I approached, I heard it again, the dragging footsteps, slow and deliberate. They weren't coming from the hallway this time. They were coming from inside my room. I stopped at the threshold, key in hand. The door was unlocked. My chest tightened. I tried to convince myself someone had broken in, but the room was silent. Everything was as I had left it. I turned on the light. Nothing. I took a deep breath, telling myself I was overreacting. That's when I noticed the mirror. My reflection was wrong. My reflection smiled, just slightly, and I hadn't. The smile widened as I stepped closer. My stomach churned. I turned abruptly. A shadow moved across the room, low and quick. I ran to the door, slamming it shut behind me. The hall stretched longer than it should have, twisting as I ran, lights flickering overhead, shadows slinking along the walls. I reached the lobby, but the clerk wasn't there. Instead, I saw a figure in the corner, hunched and gray, watching me. Its head tilted unnaturally. I ran out into the parking lot. The rain was heavier now, lashing my face, the wind whipping my clothes against me. I tried my car, but the keys were gone. The Buick in the lot hadn't been there before. Its windows dark, the engine silent. The shadow moved closer, following me, its feet silent on the wet asphalt. I ran toward the road, hoping to flag down a passing car, but the night was empty. I don't remember how I got back inside. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the hall again, outside my room. The door was open, key dangling from the lock. Inside, everything was normal. My bag was on the bed, the window closed, nothing out of place. I tried to convince myself it was a dream, but the mud on my shoes told a different story. Over the next few hours, I barely slept. I kept the light on, pacing the room. I heard whispers again, coming from the walls, the vent, the ceiling. The words were faint but chilling. Stay, stay. I tried to ignore them, telling myself I'd leave in the morning. When morning came, the clerk returned. He didn't ask about last night, didn't acknowledge the whispers or the shadows. He just handed me a receipt. "Check out," he said. His eyes lingered on mine, colder than ever. I left quickly, taking the back roads to avoid being seen. But on the drive out, I noticed something I hadn't before. The signs for the Windward Motel kept appearing, even when I had turned off the main road. Each time it looked the same. Flickering neon, empty parking lot, the Buick still there. I started to realize I might not have left at all. That night, I ended up in a different town, in a different motel, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hallway, the flickering lights, the pale figure in the corner. The whispering continued in my dreams, urging me back. I could feel it, always waiting, always watching. I called a friend the next day, trying to convince myself it was all a hallucination, a result of stress and sleeplessness. She laughed it off. Motels can be creepy, she said. But she didn't understand. It wasn't just the motel. It was the way it remembered, the way it watched, the way it followed. Weeks passed and I tried to forget. But every trip I took, every motel I stayed in, I felt it. The sense of being observed, the whisper of walls that remembered more than they should. Sometimes I would wake up in a new room and see something out of the corner of my eye. A hunched figure, pale eyes, tilting head. And every time the feeling was the same. It knew I was there. It was waiting. And the Windward Motel was never far, even if I was. I never returned to that part of Missouri, but I hear stories from travelers passing through. They mention the same motel, the same empty parking lot, the same old Buick. Some claim to hear whispers at night, see shadows moving in the hallways, smell the metallic tang in the air. I try to warn them, but they don't listen, thinking it's just a story. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really left. Sometimes I wake up in my own bed and swear I hear the whispering, faint and deliberate. Sometimes I check my locks and find them undone, key still in the door. And sometimes I see the reflection in the mirror, smiling when I'm not. The Windward Motel isn't on any official map. If you drive far enough down the back roads of rural Missouri, maybe you'll see it. The neon sign, flickering, welcoming you in. If you stop, don't let your guard down. Don't open the door to anyone. And if you hear whispering, remember. The walls remember, and they don't like being forgotten. I can't tell you why it happened to me or what it wants. I can only tell you this. It doesn't forget, and it never stops waiting. Even now, I can feel it somewhere behind me, just out of sight, always watching, always patient. The thought of returning is impossible, yet I know deep down that I never truly escaped. I carry a piece of that place with me, a memory etched in fear that wakes me in the dead of night, whispers in the hallways of my mind, and follows me wherever I go. No matter where I stay, no matter how far I drive, the memory lingers. The pale eyes, the dragging footsteps, the feeling of walls breathing around me, remembering, waiting for me to come back. Some nights, when the wind howls and the rain taps against my window, I swear I hear the familiar rapping on my door, soft and deliberate. And I know, without looking, that it's not just the wind. Story the end. It was just past midnight when I pulled off Interstate 40 in eastern Tennessee. The rain had been steady for hours, thick enough that windshield wipers barely made a dent in it, and the fluorescent lights of the small roadside motels seemed like beacons through the foggy haze. I was on a solo road trip, a mix of work and personal exploration, and my car was showing the early signs of fatigue, headlights dimmer than usual, tires squeaking in protest over the wet asphalt. I had hoped to make it to Knoxville that night, but the combination of weather and fatigue made me wary of pushing on. That's when I spotted the Blue Lantern Motel sign flickering erratically, the letters buzzing like they were barely alive. It was your typical single-story roadside motel, paint peeling, the parking lot cracked and uneven. Nothing inviting, but it was the only place for miles, and I didn't have the energy to keep driving. Inside, the lobby smelled of old carpet, cigarette smoke, and something I couldn't quite identify, like mold mixed with something metallic. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A small bell sat on the front desk, and I rang it, hearing it echo through the empty space. A man appeared from the back room, probably in his late 50s, with thinning hair and a stained polo shirt. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and I immediately felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "Evening, need a room?" he asked, his voice low and hoarse. "Yeah, just for one night," I replied, trying not to sound nervous. He handed me a key attached to a large, rusted keychain. "Number 7, end of the hall. Don't mind the carpet," he said with a shrug, then disappeared back into the shadows behind the counter. I glanced around. There were maybe 6 other rooms, doors all closed, a single elevator that didn't look like it worked, and a vending machine that blinked but didn't dispense anything. Room 7 smelled like stale smoke and damp wood. The bedspread had stains I didn't want to think about, and the floor creaked when I stepped on it. I set my bag down and noticed that the room had a window, though it was too fogged and rain-streaked to see outside clearly. On the nightstand, an old rotary phone sat, its cord tangled and fraying. For some reason, the quiet of the room felt heavier than the usual motel silence. Almost immediately, I noticed a faint tapping noise coming from the window. I told myself it was the rain, or maybe a branch against the glass. I tried to ignore it, unpacked a few things, and showered. The bathroom light flickered once, then stabilized. That's when I noticed it. Tiny scratches on the inside of the bathroom door. Shallow but deliberate, like someone had tried to scrape it from the other side. My stomach tightened. I brushed it off as previous guests, but when I laid down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept hearing the tapping at intervals, soft at first, then persistent. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud bang, like someone had slammed the window from the outside. My heart raced, and I grabbed my phone. No service. Typical, I thought, but then I noticed a shadow moving across the thin, yellowed curtains. I froze. It didn't move like a person. It was too jerky, too unnatural. I turned on the lamp, but it vanished. I tried calling the front desk, but, of course, the phone didn't work. I got up to investigate and noticed the hallway outside was darker than it should have been. Only my room's light was on. The carpet looked damp, like someone had spilled water down the hallway, though the smell of mildew was stronger. As I inched toward the door, I heard it. A whisper. Barely audible, but clear. Get out. I stumbled back, heart pounding, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind, maybe I was imagining things. But that voice had a weight to it, like it belonged to someone who had lived there for decades and wanted to be heard. I grabbed my jacket and decided to check the parking lot, thinking I could just drive off and find another motel. As I opened the door, the hallway stretched impossibly long. Room numbers didn't match what I remembered. Room 7 was still there, but the next door was labeled 21. I shook my head, telling myself I was losing it, and stepped into the hall. The air was suddenly cold, my breath visible in little puffs. The carpet squished under my feet as if soaked in water. I moved quickly toward the exit, and that's when I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the end of the hall. They weren't my own, and they didn't sound like anyone walking normally. They were heavy, dragging. I froze. The sound of the footfalls got closer, then stopped. Silence. I leaned toward the door, hand on the knob, and then I felt it. A faint pressure, like someone pressing against my back. I spun around. No one. I finally made it to the lobby. The man behind the desk was gone, and the bell had vanished. I ran for the front door, but it wouldn't budge, locked from the outside. The windows were black, not reflecting the interior light, as if the night outside didn't exist. Panic set in. I ran back down the hall, trying each room, looking for another exit. Every room was locked, but behind each door I could hear whispers, low murmurs, laughter, and crying all at once. I pressed my ear to one of the doors and heard a voice whispering my name, over and over. My name. I bolted back to room 7, desperate, and slammed the door shut. The scratches on the bathroom door had deepened, more deliberate, claw-like. I locked it, blocked it with my suitcase, and sat on the bed, trembling. The tapping returned, now on the walls inside the room, a rhythmic, mocking beat. Then the phone rang. I jumped, heart leaping into my throat. The rotary phone's line crackled. I picked it up. A voice, low and hollow, rasped, "You shouldn't be here." I slammed the phone down. The ringing continued, now faster, more insistent, until it was a deafening shriek. My ears rang, my vision blurred, and I fell to the floor, covering my head. When I opened my eyes, everything was quiet, too quiet. I looked around, and the room had changed. The walls were a sickly yellow, peeling in thick strips. The bedspread was gone, replaced by a thin, threadbare sheet that smelled of rot. The window no longer fogged. It was black, utterly black. No rain, no night, nothing. I tried the door. Locked. Again, I sat there, shaking, listening. That's when I heard it. The footsteps again, now inside my room. Slow, dragging, circling me. I could feel the air move as the presence passed close by, and I realized it was watching me. Waiting. I didn't know how long I sat there, eyes fixed on the floor, every nerve screaming. Hours, maybe minutes. I couldn't tell. Then a soft, cold hand rested on my shoulder. I froze, not daring to move. The voice from the phone whispered in my ear, "You can leave, if you can survive." I bolted toward the bathroom, flung the door open, and the scratches had formed words. Run. I didn't need further instruction. I dove out the window, somehow it was unlocked, and landed in the parking lot, mud and rain soaking through my clothes. I didn't stop running until my car was in sight. I turned the key. Nothing. The engine was dead. I pounded the steering wheel, screaming, and then I saw movement in the rain. Figures walking in the lot, slow, dragging, watching. I didn't recognize faces, only shadows of shapes, but I felt their eyes. I jumped out, sprinted across the lot, and as I did, one of the figures raised its head. Hollow eyes, a twisted grin, and it whispered my name. I ran into the woods beside the lot, the rain cutting down, branches slapping my face, until finally I found the highway again. I didn't look back. It took hours for me to get service. I called a friend in Knoxville, voice trembling, and told them to find me a real hotel. I drove the rest of the night, unable to shake the images of those hollow eyes, the voices calling my name, the feeling of cold fingers brushing my skin. When I finally got to Knoxville, exhausted and soaked, I collapsed in the motel bed, trying to convince myself it had all been a dream. But when I reached for my phone, the screen displayed a missed call from an unknown number. I answered it automatically. A hollow, rasping voice said only, "Room 7, still waits." I didn't sleep for days. I avoided that stretch of I-40 for months. Eventually, I tried to rationalize it. Stress, exhaustion, rain, old building. But a month later, a coworker sent me a news link. Someone had gone missing at the Blue Lantern Motel, last seen in room 7. The details were sparse, just that the owner was a recluse. The place had a history of strange disappearances. I didn't want to know more, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Weeks later, when I was back on that highway for work, I kept my eyes on the road. But through the rain, I saw the same flickering sign, the same peeling paint. And in the window of room 7, I thought I saw a shadow, hunched, waiting. I turned the car sharply and drove past. Even now, years later, I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, hearing soft scratching at my bedroom door. Sometimes I see shadows at the window, even though I live on the 10th floor of an apartment building, and every once in a while my phone rings, an unknown number, and that same rasping voice whispers my name. I know it's still out there. I know it still waits for me. And I know that if I ever go back to that stretch of I-40, if I ever pull over at that motel again, I won't be leaving. Story the end. The highway was deserted. The kind of emptiness that makes the night feel alive with possibilities you don't want to encounter. I had been driving for hours, chasing the orange streak of sunset until it vanished behind rolling hills, leaving nothing but black asphalt and the occasional reflective highway marker. My car's headlights cut swaths of pale light through the darkness, but it was like slicing through fog. Rain began lightly at first, pattering on the windshield, then gathering into a steady, soaking downpour that made the wipers squeal and smear the glass with streaks of water. I hadn't planned to stop yet. I liked the road at night, the solitude, the endless motion, but the storm made my eyes ache. My back hurt from hours in the seat, and my stomach churned with hunger and anxiety. I began scanning the roadside for a place to pull off, something safe, something open. That's when I saw it, a neon sign flickering in the rain like a dying heartbeat. Blue Lantern Motel, vacancy. The sign's glow shimmered on the wet asphalt, half the letters dead, but vacancy burned red. My grip on the wheel loosened as I turned off the interstate, tires hissing over waterlogged cracks in the pavement. The motel looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades. A long, low building ran along a crooked parking lot, the paint peeling from each door, some doors warped and sagging. The asphalt was cracked, puddles reflecting the broken neon, creating a surreal, distorted mirror of the place. Only a handful of cars were scattered in the lot. An old green sedan with rust blooming along the wheel wells, and a white van with its windows darkened, looking abandoned. I climbed out of the car, rain soaking through my jacket almost immediately. The office door was a small, square structure at the motel's end, the kind that made you think it might collapse if someone leaned too hard on the frame. A flickering light above the door buzzed intermittently, illuminating a bell on the counter inside. I stepped in, and the smell hit me first: damp carpet, mildew, and the faint lingering odor of cigarettes. Behind the counter, a man looked up at me slowly. His hair was thin, gray, slicked back in a way that suggested he had never thought about style beyond 40 years ago. A bristly mustache framed his mouth, and his skin looked leathery, stretched tight over high cheekbones. His eyes lingered on me in a way that made me uneasy, but he spoke without moving his lips much. "You need a room?" "Yeah," I said, my voice low. "Just for tonight. Got caught in the storm." He didn't respond immediately. He flipped through a worn ledger with pages yellowed and curling at the edges, the pencil scratching across them faintly. Finally, he muttered, "Cash, $40. No credit cards." I handed him 2 20s, and he tucked them into a drawer with a dull thunk, not meeting my eyes. He pulled a tarnished key from a hook behind him and slid it across the counter. The tag read Room 7 in faded black letters. "End of the hall. Don't lose it. Checkout's 10. He returned to staring at the muted television behind him, a flickering infomercial for some exercise gadget that looked older than the motel itself. I didn't wait for further instructions. I grabbed my bag and dashed through the rain, shivering as I ran toward room 7. The door was warped, the key sticking stubbornly before it finally turned. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by a lamp with a crooked shade. The carpet was a deep brown with stains that suggested years of neglect. The bedspread was faded floral, and the mattress sagged in the center. The air smelled damp, with a faint tang of something metallic. A heater under the window rattled when I turned it on, sputtering out warm, stale air. I set my bag on the floor and flicked the television on. It was an old boxy set, channels flickering, mostly static, until I found a local news station. The anchor spoke in monotone about a recent string of burglaries, but I couldn't focus. The storm outside thumped on the roof with a rhythmic intensity, lulling me toward a restless sleep. Hours passed. I don't know how many. I woke suddenly, heart racing, because the room felt different. The air was heavier, stiller. My blanket had slipped to the edge of the bed. The television had shut off, leaving only a faint glow from the streetlight outside filtering through the blinds. Then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps on the carpet outside my door. My pulse jumped. I froze, straining to hear. The steps stopped, then started again, moving slowly down the hall, fading away. I told myself it was another guest, but instinctively I knew it wasn't. I grabbed the small flashlight from my bag and crept toward the door. The hallway was empty when I cracked it open, silent except for the persistent hum of the heater in my room. I stepped into the hall, scanning left and right. The lights above flickered weakly. The other rooms were all dark. My stomach knotted as I noticed marks on the carpet. Scratches, long, deep, running along the edge of the hallway toward the far end. I backed into my room and locked the door, sliding the chain into place. I could hear a faint scratching at the far end of the hall, deliberate, like someone dragging something metal along the floor. My hands shook so badly I dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly across the walls. Hours seemed to pass. I stayed pressed against the door, clutching the flashlight, too terrified to sleep. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the blinds. I forced myself to breathe, slowly, carefully, until I felt enough courage to move. I packed quickly, grabbing my bag and slinging it over my shoulder. My eyes kept darting to the door, every nerve on edge. I unlocked the chain, slipped the key into the lock, and opened the door. The hallway was empty. But then I noticed the scratches. They were deeper now, almost claw-like, running from the other end of the hall to my door. Fresh. I felt bile rise in my throat. I didn't go to the office to check out. I threw the key into my bag, ran to the car, and got on the highway, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't glance back at the Blue Lantern Motel, even though the neon sign still flickered, calling travelers in like a siren. Weeks later, I couldn't shake the memory. Every rainstorm, every late-night drive past a lonely roadside motel, my stomach tightened. I thought about the figure, whoever or whatever it was, standing at the far end of the hall, the deep scratches in the carpet, and the silence that followed when I tried to rationalize it. A month later, I came across a news article. A young couple had gone missing at the Blue Lantern Motel. Their car was found abandoned in the lot. The description of the room they stayed in matched mine. The article mentioned scratches on the carpet, marks on the walls, and something even more unsettling. The maid who cleaned the room reported seeing a shadow move past the doorway at night, despite the motel being empty except for her. I never drove that route again. And when I hear the rain pattering on my window at night, I still see the scratches, the dark hallway, and the sense of being watched, waiting for someone or something to appear in the doorway. Story, the end. The rain had been falling for hours, streaking the highway with sheets of silver that reflected every streetlight like a twisted mirror. Jenna Thompson had been driving since late afternoon, trying to escape the drumming storm and the long stretch of loneliness that came with traveling solo on back roads. Her rental car's wipers beat a frantic rhythm against the windshield, the tires hissing on wet asphalt. She was tired, cold, and hungry, and when the dim glow of a neon sign flickered through the downpour, she didn't hesitate. The sign read Evergreen Motel. The neon buzzed, the letters E and T glowing faintly while the rest seemed dead or broken. The building sat low and L-shaped at the end of a cracked gravel lot, flanked by a few dying pines and a rusted-out swing set that looked abandoned for decades. The smell of wet earth and mildew hit her as she parked under the flickering sign. Only 2 cars sat in the lot, an old rust-colored sedan and a white pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in years. She stepped out, rain dripping from her hood, and felt the oppressive quiet settle over the lot. There were no sounds of other people, no humming lights from other rooms, just the rain, the wind, and the occasional creak of the motel's siding as the wind tugged at it. Inside the office, the air was thick with the smell of cigarettes and something sour that made her stomach churn. An elderly man sat behind the counter, hunched over a ledger. His glasses were smudged, and he seemed almost part of the shadows as he wrote, looking up. A single bulb overhead flickered in time with the neon outside. "Room?" he croaked without lifting his head. "Yes, please. Just for the night." Jenna tried to smile, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her nerves. "Cash," he said, finally raising his gaze. His eyes were dark, almost hollow. 35 a night. Jenna reached into her wallet, pulling out bills. "Credit card? Cash. No cards." His voice was soft but commanding, leaving no room for argument. She handed him the money, and he counted it slowly, deliberately. When he pushed a tarnished brass key across the counter, it was attached to a faded red fob marked Room 12. "Top of the stairs, end of the hall. Don't go in the back room," he muttered. Jenna paused. "Back room?" He didn't look up. "Room 12. Don't go in the back room. Don't knock on doors that aren't yours." She nodded quickly, ignoring the uneasy pit growing in her stomach. The hallway was narrow and smelled of damp carpet. The flickering overhead lights made the walls seem to shift. Room 12's door was at the far end, and the key turned in the lock with a soft click. Inside the room was standard motel fare. A bed with thin linens, a small TV, and a dresser. The wallpaper was faded yellow with water stains, and the curtains were thick, brown, and heavy. Jenna set her bag down and went to the window. Outside, the storm hadn't let up, and the neon sign buzzed faintly in the rain. She closed the curtains, remembering the man's words. Something about them lingered in her mind, like a warning she couldn't shake. The TV was dead, only static filling the screen, a high-pitched whine that grated on her nerves. She turned it off and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm herself. Her phone had no service, so calling for help wasn't an option. Then she heard it. A slow, deliberate tapping at the window. Jenna froze, her heart thudding. The curtains were drawn, but the taps continued. 3 slow raps against the glass. She swallowed hard, her breath coming shallow and fast. "Who's there?" she called softly, hoping the sound of her voice would scare whatever it was away. No reply, just the tapping again, more urgent this time. Her instincts screamed to run, but her feet felt rooted to the carpet. The third tap was almost violent, rattling the window frame. Then came a whisper, soft and breathy, almost a hiss. "Jenna." Her eyes widened. That was her name. She hadn't told anyone here her name. Nobody knew. The whisper came again, closer this time, almost inside the room. "Jenna, open it." Cold sweat coated her skin. She gripped the bedspread, shaking. The rational part of her mind told her it was just a trick of the storm, maybe her imagination. But the instinct in her gut screamed that this was not human. Minutes passed in paralyzing silence, Then the whispering began again, now from multiple directions. From behind the door, from the corners of the room, from inside her head. "Jenna! Come out! Come with me!" The heavy curtains suddenly shifted, as though a hand had brushed against them from the inside. Her stomach sank. She couldn't breathe. Then she heard it. A scratching, wet and slow, along the walls. It wasn't on the other side of the door. It was inside. The sound moved closer to the bed, each scratch punctuated by a low, gurgling moan that seemed to echo through the room. She scrambled to her feet, yanking open the door. The hallway was empty, silent except for the storm outside. She ran down the stairs, slipping on wet steps, not stopping until she reached the parking lot. Her car was where she'd left it. The motel office was dark, the door locked, and the neon sign flickered violently, buzzing like it was about to explode. She didn't look back as she started the engine, tires skidding on the gravel. Only when she was on the highway, the rain blurring the lights behind her, did she allow herself to breathe. But even then, in the rearview mirror, she could swear she saw a figure standing behind the flickering neon sign, watching her. The darkness of the motel stretching its presence across the stormy night. No matter how far she drove, Jenna never forgot the feeling of those whispered words, the cold weight of unseen eyes in her room, and the sense that whatever had been inside room 12 was still there, waiting for the next traveler foolish enough to stop. From that night on, whenever she drove through small towns on lonely highways, she would glance at the motels tucked into the shadows, and a chill would crawl up her spine. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Story the end. It was early October 2014 when I decided to take a solo road trip from Chicago down to Dallas. I had no strict schedule, just a feeling that I needed to clear my head after a rough breakup and a stressful month at work. The highways were familiar at first, but after hours of driving through the dark stretches of rural Illinois and Missouri, everything started to look the same. Fields, corn silos, and the occasional gas station with flickering lights. By the time night fell, exhaustion was pressing in, and I knew I needed a place to stay. I hadn't planned ahead. I'd assumed I'd make it to St. Louis or beyond, but fatigue had me eyeing every small roadside motel. It was somewhere near Poplar Bluff, Missouri, when I noticed a hand-painted sign on the side of the highway. The paint was peeling, the letters uneven. Sunset Inn, vacancy. The property itself looked old, with a single two-story building set back from the road and a parking lot covered in cracked asphalt. A flickering fluorescent light above the office door barely illuminated a small porch with a sagging roof. I parked in front of the office and stepped inside. The air smelled like dust, mothballs, and something faintly metallic that made me wrinkle my nose. Behind the glass counter sat a woman, maybe in her early 60s, wearing a floral blouse and an apron that looked decades out of date. Her hair was gray, pulled into a bun that had seen better days. She didn't smile as I approached. "Room for the night?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "Yes. Cash or check? No cards." That was strange, but I was too tired to care. I handed over $50, and she scribbled something in a ledger that looked as old as the building. "Room 12, second floor, last door on the left. Do not leave your door unlocked, and do not open the back stairwell." Her tone was firm, almost warning, and I laughed nervously. She didn't respond, just handed me a rusty metal key attached to a faded red plastic fob. The stairs creaked loudly as I climbed to the second floor. The hallway smelled of mildew and something sweeter, like decaying flowers. I reached room 12, the last door on the left, and tried the key. The lock groaned, but it eventually turned. Inside, the room was sparse. 2 twin beds, a small nightstand with a lamp that barely worked, and a television with a thick layer of dust. The window overlooked the empty parking lot and the fields beyond. I set my bag down and checked the door locks, sliding the deadbolt and hoping it would hold. The air conditioner was old and rattled every time it kicked on, but it was better than the stifling heat outside. I brushed my teeth, trying to ignore the feeling that someone was watching me. I fell asleep eventually, but not for long. Around 1:45 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Slow, deliberate, dragging, like someone was pacing. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped at my door, and then I heard a faint scraping as if someone was trying to test the lock. My heart was pounding. I wanted to call out, but my voice felt stuck. After what seemed like an eternity, the footsteps continued down the hall and faded away. I lay there awake, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, but sleep wouldn't come again. Morning came reluctantly, casting a weak light into the room through yellowed curtains. I tried to shake off the previous night's terror, but something about the motel felt wrong. At breakfast, which was nothing more than a small coffee pot and some stale muffins set out in the lobby, I asked the woman behind the counter about the building's history. Her eyes narrowed. People come and go, nothing much happens here. Her tone suggested the opposite. I didn't press further. Before leaving, I went to my car and noticed that a dark stain had appeared near the edge of the parking lot, close to the back stairwell she had warned me not to use. I hesitated, but then started the engine, not wanting to linger. As I drove away, I looked back at the Sunset Inn. Through one of the second-floor windows, I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving. A figure standing at the edge of the hallway, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. It wasn't until weeks later that I read a local news article that made my stomach drop. The Sunset Inn had been abandoned years ago, after several bodies were discovered buried beneath the parking lot and behind the motel. The woman who ran the front desk had long been suspected in the disappearances. Neighbors said travelers would check in and never leave. A handful of survivors described being held in the back rooms, trapped and frightened, until they found a way to escape. I remembered the footsteps, the scraping at my door, and the shadow in the window. I realized then that I had been lucky, perhaps because I had left before night fell completely. I never drove through that area again at night. Even now, whenever I see an old, isolated motel on a stretch of highway, I feel that same tightness in my chest. I think about room 12, the back stairwell, and the woman at the counter, and I remind myself that some places are better left alone. Some roads are safer when you never stop. Story the end. I had been driving through the back roads of West Virginia on a late summer night, heading home after visiting an old college friend in Charleston. The trip had taken longer than expected. Construction, traffic, and a dead GPS signal in the mountains. By the time I reached a stretch near a small town called Red Hollow, it was well past midnight. My eyes were heavy, and I knew I couldn't make it home safely without stopping. As I crested a hill, I saw a dim neon sign flickering weakly through the trees, Cedar Pines Motel. The paint was faded, and the sign buzzed intermittently. The place looked small and run down, but the sight of it felt like a lifeline. I turned off the main road onto the gravel lot. A couple of older cars were parked haphazardly, their windows fogged with condensation. The office was a tiny shack with a single light above the door, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside, an older woman sat behind a desk cluttered with papers and a half-empty coffee cup. She wore a faded floral dress, her hair in a tight bun. Her eyes were dark and sharp. "Room for the night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She nodded slowly. "One night only?" "Yes," I replied. She dug through a drawer, then handed me a brass key with a cracked plastic tag. "Room 12, second floor. Stairs are fine, but the carpet's a bit worn." I took the key and made my way to the stairs. The hallway was narrow and smelled faintly of mildew and old smoke. The carpet was threadbare and the wallpaper peeled in places. Room 12 was at the end of the hall. I opened the door to find a small room with a double bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a bathroom with a faint mold smell. After a long shower, I climbed into bed, hoping to sleep quickly. Around 11:45, I heard it, a low thumping sound from the room next door. Slow, methodical, almost like someone was pacing. I told myself it was another guest, restless or drunk. But the sound persisted, sometimes stopping, sometimes resuming, always keeping me on edge. Then came the whispering. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, coming from the vent above the bathroom. My heart skipped. I strained to listen, and I could make out words. "Go. Leave. Now." I stood, my hands shaking, and checked the window. The glass was fogged from the humidity outside, but there was a handprint smeared downward. Not one that had been there for a while. It looked recent, pressed by someone or something small and heavy. I tried to rationalize. Maybe a kid staying with a parent next door, maybe my imagination. I turned back to the bed, but the mirror on the dresser reflected movement. A shadow, crouched low, shifting along the edges of the glass. I spun around. Empty room. The whispering intensified right next to my ear. "Don't stay." Leave. I bolted to the door, my pulse racing. The hallway was silent. The stairs creaked as if someone or something was behind me, following. I ran to the lobby. Empty. The woman behind the desk was gone. Not a single sound. I ran back to the car, sliding in and starting the engine. As I drove away, the motel's sign flickered violently, and in the rearview mirror I thought I saw a figure standing in one of the second-floor windows. A woman, thin and tall, her hair dark and long, wet as if from rain, staring at me. She didn't move, just watched. Later, I checked online. Cedar Pines Motel had been closed for years after a series of mysterious disappearances. Locals whispered that travelers who stayed the night never returned the same, or at all. The place was supposed to be abandoned, yet somehow the lights still flickered, and rooms were still rented. I don't drive that road anymore, but sometimes late at night, when I hear about motels in remote areas or see a faint flickering light in the distance, I remember the whispers, the shadow in the mirror, and the icy feeling of being watched. Some places aren't meant for anyone to stay. Story the end. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the highway into a slick ribbon of black that reflected the occasional flash of lightning. I was driving alone, heading back from a work conference in Oklahoma City to my small town in Texas. The roads were nearly empty, just the hum of my tires on wet asphalt and the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. I'd been on the road for nearly 8 hours straight, and fatigue was setting in. That's when I saw it. A small motel off the exit ramp, its sign half lit, buzzing in the darkness. It read, Willow Creek Inn, though the paint was peeling and the letters flickered in and out with the broken neon tubes. I slowed and pulled into the gravel lot. There was a faint glow from the office, but the parking lot was otherwise empty. I didn't even consider looking for another option. My car was running low on fuel, and I didn't have the energy to keep driving in the storm. The office was a tiny structure with a single glass window and a bell on the counter. I rang it, and a woman appeared, older, with stringy hair and a pale complexion that made her look almost ghostly. She didn't smile, she just stared at me and said, "Room for one night?" "Yes," I replied, trying to sound confident. "Just one." She nodded, handed me a key with a faded red tag, and muttered, "Third floor, end of the hall. Watch your step." Her voice was soft, almost like a whisper, but carried an odd weight. I thanked her and hurried to my car, dropping my suitcase in the back seat. The stairs to the third floor were narrow, wooden, and creaked under every step. I felt a chill climb up my spine as I reached the hallway. The carpet was damp and stained, the walls lined with outdated wallpaper patterned with flowers that had faded long ago. Room 312 was at the end, its door slightly ajar. I paused, thinking I had remembered the number wrong, but the key fit perfectly. The room smelled of mildew, old smoke, and something metallic that made my stomach twist. I set my suitcase down and flicked on the light. The lamp beside the bed buzzed before stabilizing, casting weak shadows across the room. The furniture was old, the sheets wrinkled and damp, and the mirror over the dresser reflected a room that felt too dark even under the ceiling light. I was exhausted, so I decided to shower and sleep immediately. But as I undressed, I noticed a faint set of scratches along the wall near the bed, thin lines that looked fresh despite the general decay of the room. I chalked it up to rats or the old building settling and stepped into the shower. The water pressure was weak, the temperature inconsistent, and the mirror fogged so quickly that I could barely see my reflection. After drying off, I climbed into bed, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my arms and legs. That's when I heard it, faint tapping like someone drumming their fingers on the wall beside my head. I froze, listening. The sound was deliberate, slow, methodical. I told myself it was the wind or the old building shifting, but it didn't stop. It continued for minutes, maybe hours. I couldn't tell. I reached for my phone. No service. Nothing. I tried the office. No answer. Panic started to settle in, a tight knot in my chest. Then the light flickered, and the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows pooling in corners that shouldn't even exist. Suddenly, I saw her. Standing in the corner of the room, barely visible, her hair long and stringy, her face pale and eyes dark as coal. She didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched me. My heart raced, and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I bolted upright in bed, and she was gone. The room was empty again. I convinced myself it was a nightmare, an exhaustion-induced hallucination, and tried to sleep again. The whispers began then, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the vents, the walls, everywhere and nowhere at once. I covered my ears, shaking, but the voices only got louder, punctuated by the soft sound of footsteps walking slowly down the hall outside my door. I didn't dare check. I couldn't. I sat in the corner of the bed, my back against the wall, waiting for the night to end. Hours passed. The room remained silent after a while, the air heavy and suffocating. I stayed frozen, afraid to move, until the faint light of dawn finally seeped through the blinds. I ran to the office, but the woman was gone. The desk was empty, the window locked, and there were no cars in the lot. I jumped in my car, heart pounding, and didn't stop until I reached the nearest town 30 miles away. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I tried to look up the Willow Creek Inn. There were no records, no reviews, no address, nothing. I called the local sheriff's office, asking if there was a motel on that stretch of highway, and the officer paused before saying, "There used to be a small place there years ago. Burned down, long time ago. Nobody survived. Folks say the site's cursed. People claim it still stands on stormy nights." I felt my stomach drop. Every detail, the smell, the scratches, the whispers, the shadow, was real. I hadn't imagined it. Even now, driving late at night, I avoid that highway. But sometimes, when the storm is heavy and the neon light flickers in my peripheral vision, I swear I see the Willow Creek Inn, waiting for someone tired, lost, and desperate enough to stop. And I know that the woman I saw in room 312 isn't gone. She's still there, standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. I've told friends about it, and most laugh it off. But I know what I experienced was real. And I know that if you find yourself driving alone on a stormy night and a small motel beckons with a flickering sign, you should keep going. Some rooms are not meant for the living, and once you enter, they don't let you leave. I still wake up at night hearing faint tapping from corners of my room, whispers I can't place, shadows that seem to move just beyond my vision. I try to convince myself it's just memory, but deep down, I know the Willow Creek Inn is out there, waiting for the next traveler who thinks a room for the night is all they need. And maybe if you drive that highway, you'll see it too. The flickering neon, the peeling paint, the empty parking lot. Maybe you'll feel that pull, like the motel itself is calling you, whispering that you belong there. And maybe if you stop, you never leave. Story, the end. I was driving through rural Kentucky late one summer night, alone, heading home from a long road trip through the Appalachian foothills. The sun had set hours ago, leaving only the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness. The road was narrow, twisting, flanked by dense forest on either side. Every few miles I'd pass an old farmhouse or a rusted-out barn, and sometimes nothing at all. Sleep was tugging at my eyelids, and I knew I had to find a place to stop before exhaustion made the road too dangerous. After what felt like an endless stretch of winding blacktop, a flickering neon sign appeared through the trees. Whispering Pines Motel. The red and green letters buzzed faintly, some parts flickering more than others. The building itself looked like it had been there for decades. The paint was chipped and peeling, and the gravel parking lot was uneven, with tufts of grass poking through. One old sedan sat near the office, its windows fogged and dirty. I parked and stepped out into the humid night air. The motel building was silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The office was a small wooden shack with a single swinging porch light. Inside, a man in his 70s sat behind a cluttered counter. His eyes were dark, almost piercing, and he looked at me like he had been expecting me. "Room for the night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded slowly. "Single?" "Yes." He handed me a brass key with a worn paper tag. "Room 8, second floor. Be careful on the stairs." I thanked him and headed up the narrow wooden staircase. Each step groaned under my weight. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew and smoke, and the carpet was worn thin. Room 8 was at the far end of the hall. I pushed open the door to a small, dimly lit room with a double bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a small bathroom with a faint, musty odor. I set my bag down, planning to shower and get some rest. After turning on the water, I noticed something odd. A dark smudge on the bathroom mirror, shaped vaguely like a hand, smeared downward. I wiped it off, telling myself it was nothing, probably old residue from a previous guest. After showering, I lay in bed trying to fall asleep. Around 11:50, I heard it, a slow, deliberate thumping sound coming from the room next door. My pulse quickened. I tried to convince myself it was just another guest moving around, but the sound didn't stop. Thump, 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 rhythmic, deliberate, pacing. Then came the whispering, faint at first, coming from the vent above the bathroom. My ears strained, and I could make out the words, "Go, leave, now." I got out of bed, heart pounding, and checked the room. Nothing. I went to the window. Outside, the lot was deserted except for the old sedan. I turned back, and that's when I saw it, a shadowy figure reflected in the cracked dresser mirror. Low, hunched, almost crawling along the edges of the glass. I spun around. The room was empty. The whispering intensified right next to my ear. "Don't sleep here." I bolted for the door, racing down the hallway. The stairs creaked under my weight, and I could swear I heard faint footsteps behind me, pacing in rhythm with my own. I made it to the lobby. Empty. The old man was gone. The swinging porch light outside flickered violently, casting long, distorted shadows across the lobby walls. I ran to my car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. In the rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing in the window of room 8. Tall, thin, with long black hair hanging in wet strands, face pale and expressionless. She didn't move, just watched. Weeks later, I looked up Whispering Pines Motel online. It had been abandoned for decades, the site of multiple disappearances, travelers who checked in late and were never heard from again. The locals said the place was cursed, that it fed on those who stayed the night. I never drove that stretch of road at night again. But sometimes when I see a faint, flickering motel sign on a deserted highway, I remember that night, the whispers, the shadow in the mirror, and the cold dread that pressed against me as if the building itself wanted me gone. Some places on the road aren't just rundown. They're alive, and they're waiting. Story the end. It was late September when I found myself driving through western Oklahoma, a region I barely knew, trying to get home after a week-long work trip. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the sky was a bruised shade of purple and black. The road stretched endlessly, flanked by empty fields and a few scattered barns. My phone battery was at 10%, and there hadn't been a gas station for miles. The GPS flickered uncertainly before finally giving up entirely. That's when I saw it, the sign for the Sunset Pines Motel, glowing faintly in the distance. Its letters were half-lit, some bulbs burnt out, giving the sign a jagged, almost sinister look. I slowed and pulled into the gravel lot. The motel looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. The neon sign buzzed faintly and flickered sporadically. Only one car was parked out front, a rusty pickup truck with the bed full of unidentifiable junk. The air smelled like wet leaves and decay, a mix that made my stomach turn. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, furnished with mismatched chairs and a cracked coffee table. Behind the desk sat a woman who looked far too young for the tired expression on her face. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her eyes had a sharpness to them that made me uncomfortable. "Room?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She didn't speak at first, just stared at me, tilting her head slightly. Finally, she said, "Fourth room on the left, number 31. Don't mind the noises. They're harmless." I raised an eyebrow but didn't press her. I had little choice. It was late, and the storm clouds overhead threatened rain. I took the key and walked down the hall. The carpeting was worn and stained, and the walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in places. The lights flickered above me, casting shadows that moved when I didn't. Room 31 smelled faintly of mildew and dust. The bed was unmade, sheets wrinkled and yellowed, and the window rattled with the wind. I set my bag down, eager to get some rest. But as soon as I sat on the bed, I heard it. A soft, dragging sound from the other side of the room, like someone pulling their feet across the floor. I froze. The sound stopped. I told myself it was the wind, the old building settling. I tried to ignore it, laying down and pulling the blankets up. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispers. Low, almost imperceptible words that didn't make sense but carried a weight of menace. Around midnight, I woke to a sudden cold. My room was freezing, the blankets pulled from my body by some unseen force. I turned on the light. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, twisting and stretching. That's when I noticed the figure by the door, thin, hunched, with skin pale and almost translucent. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and it tilted its head unnaturally, studying me. I bolted upright, heart hammering. The figure vanished. My rational mind screamed that I was hallucinating, exhausted and stressed, but the sense of being watched was undeniable. I left the light on and paced the room, listening to the soft creaking and scratching sounds that came from the walls. In the morning, I decided to leave, but when I tried the door, it wouldn't budge. The key was in my hand, but the lock refused to turn. I pounded on the door, shouting for help. Eventually, the woman at the desk appeared, calm as ever. "You have to wait," she said. "It only leaves when it's ready." I froze. "What leaves?" She didn't answer, just walked away, leaving me alone. The dragging sounds started again, circling the room, moving faster this time. I could hear soft breathing behind me, the cold of the room intensifying. I pressed myself against the far wall, trying to make myself small, trying not to draw attention. Hours passed. I don't know how long. When the woman finally returned, she handed me a piece of paper with the new key number scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Change rooms. They'll follow if you don't," she said, her eyes scanning the hall nervously. I followed her instructions, moving to room 34. The hallway seemed longer than before, distorted almost, twisting in ways that made no sense. When I entered the room, the air was thick and heavy, like it had been breathing all along. The bed was made neatly, but I felt the same oppressive presence as in my original room. That night, the whispers grew louder. I could make out words now, broken and cruel. "Why are you here? You shouldn't be here. Leave." Every time I tried to speak or shout, my voice caught in my throat. The shadow in the corner returned, hunched, tilting its head, always watching. I tried to sleep, but every surface of the room seemed to pulse, the walls tightening like a cage. I eventually fell into a fitful, dreamless sleep, waking hours later to find scratches on the walls, long and jagged, as if someone or something had been clawing from the other side. The next morning, I gathered my courage and tried to check out. The desk was empty, the lobby silent. The door to the office was locked, the key missing. I tried calling for someone, but there was no phone, and my phone battery had died overnight. I felt the weight of the motel pressing down on me. Every corridor looked identical, every corner a mirror of another. I realized I could be walking in circles. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I had no sense of time. I stumbled into a room marked 27 and froze. Inside was the same figure, hunched and silent, its eyes glowing faintly. It didn't move, but seemed to watch my every breath. My heart raced, and I felt the cold of its presence seep into my bones. I backed out slowly, only to find the hall stretched impossibly long, twisting and turning, doors appearing where none should be. Panic set in. I ran blindly down the corridors, but every door I tried was locked. Finally, I collapsed in a corner, shaking, trying to catch my breath. The whispers surrounded me, words repeating in a chant, "You can't leave. You can't leave. You can't leave." Eventually, I found the exit, or what I thought was the exit. The gravel lot lay ahead, rain pouring down, visibility low. My car was gone. The Buick from the lot the first night sat where I had parked, its windows dark. I ran toward it, but it felt miles away, no matter how fast I ran. The figure followed, silent, hunched, eyes fixed on me. By dawn, I had stumbled into the road, hitching a ride with a passing trucker who didn't ask questions. I looked back, desperate, and saw the motel again, impossibly close and impossibly distant at the same time, its neon flickering in the early light. The whispers lingered in my mind, and even though I was miles away, I could still feel it watching. I've never returned to Oklahoma. I've never tried to find that motel again, but the memory haunts me. Every time I stay in a roadside motel, I notice the corners of the ceiling, the shadows that linger too long. I hear whispers when no one else is around, and I feel cold spots where there should be warmth. I've tried telling friends, but no one believes me. They say I was stressed, overworked, imagining things, but I know the truth. I know the presence that lives in those corridors, waiting, patient, watching for the next traveler who thinks they're safe, who thinks they can just stop for the night. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see the hallway stretching endlessly before me, the fluorescent lights flickering, and the pale, hunched figure at the end tilting its head. I know it remembers me, and I know it's still waiting, And I know in some corner of the world, the Sunset Pines Motel is still there, welcoming the next stranger, the next lost traveler, the next person who thinks they can escape. Story the end. It was around 11 p.m. when I realized I wasn't going to make it to Nashville before the gaslight came on. The sky had opened up in a sudden downpour, the kind that turns highways into rivers, and I hadn't seen a rest stop for at least 30 miles. My GPS was acting up, flickering between signals, and every exit seemed deserted. That's when I saw it. A neon sign that sputtered Silver Pines Motel, one letter buzzing and flickering so fast it almost looked like it was alive. The building itself was a long, low structure with faded paint, a parking lot full of puddles, and a faint orange glow from a few dimly lit rooms. I pulled in, the tires crunching over gravel. The lobby smelled like old coffee and damp carpet. A ceiling fan spun lazily above a single wooden desk, where a young man sat, maybe in his early 20s, wearing a thin hoodie and headphones around his neck. He looked up when I approached, expression flat. "Room for the night?" I asked. "Yeah, room 4, he muttered, sliding a key across the counter without looking at me. "End of the hall." I nodded and paid, but something about him made me uneasy, like he wasn't used to seeing guests, or maybe he didn't care. The lobby was empty, except for the faint hum of a vending machine and the flickering fluorescent lights. I carried my bag down the long hallway, past doors numbered unevenly, 3, 4, 6, 8. Room 4 was at the very end, the door scratched around the handle. Inside, the room smelled like mildew and something sharp, metallic. The bedspread had dark stains, and the walls were a sickly yellow with peeling wallpaper. I set my things down, noticing that the window faced the parking lot, though I could barely see through the sheets of rain. The TV was old, a small box in the corner, but it worked. I tried to shake off the tension, thinking maybe I just needed to dry off and rest. About an hour later, I noticed it. A faint tapping at the window, soft at first, like someone drumming their fingers. I told myself it was just the rain, maybe a branch brushing against the glass. Then came the whispering, barely audible, coming from the hall outside my room. I froze. It wasn't a normal sound. It was layered, overlapping voices, some crying, some laughing, all low, distorted. I tried calling the front desk, but the phone didn't work. I grabbed my keys and went to check the door. But as soon as I stepped into the hall, I realized something was wrong. The hall was darker than it should have been, the carpet wet and sticky under my feet. The doors weren't in the order I had walked by earlier, and the numbers seemed to have shifted. Room 4 was still there, but across from it was a door numbered 12, which hadn't been there before. I tried to backtrack, but the hall seemed endless. The whispers grew louder, now chanting my name. I could feel something moving just beyond my vision, a presence that shifted and crept along the walls. My stomach turned, and I ran back to room 4, slamming the door behind me. The scratches around the knob had deepened, forming lines that looked almost like fingers. I barricaded the door with the dresser, but the tapping returned, now on the walls inside the room. I could hear heavy breathing, dragging across the floor as if someone, or something, was pacing. The phone rang, shrill and sudden. I jumped, picking it up. The voice on the other end was low, guttural. "You shouldn't have come here." I hung up. The ringing continued, faster and more insistent. My ears were ringing, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I dove toward the window, thinking I could escape that way. But when I opened it, the rain outside had stopped. Instead, a thick darkness stretched endlessly, the parking lot gone, replaced by a void. I stumbled back, my hand brushing the nightstand, and something cold and hard pressed against my shoulder. I spun around. Nothing. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. I lost all sense of time. The whispers grew into a chorus, voices overlapping in madness. Then came the footsteps, slow and dragging, circling my bed. I could feel them, not just hear them, pressing into the floor, the walls, the very air. My chest ached from fear. Suddenly, the window shattered inward. Cold rain, or maybe something colder, drenched me. A shadow fell across the room, tall and distorted, edges shimmering like smoke. The whispers turned into a roar. "Leave!" I scrambled toward the door, but the handle twisted in my hand. It wasn't locked. It wouldn't turn. I backed into the corner, shaking. The shadow moved closer, bending, shifting, a figure with hollow eyes and a grin that stretched too wide. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The figure leaned down, and I could feel its breath, rancid and wet, on my face. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. The room was quiet again. The window was intact, the hall visible beyond my door, normal. I hesitated, then ran. I didn't check the number on the doors. I just ran, pounding down the hall, through the lobby, out into the parking lot. The young man at the desk was gone. The vending machine hummed, empty and still. I got into my car, shaking so hard I could barely start it. When I did, I didn't look back. I drove through the night, heart hammering, eyes darting to the dark tree lines along the highway. When dawn broke, I stopped at the first gas station I could find and tried to calm down. I told myself it was stress, the storm, exhaustion. A week later, curiosity, or foolishness, led me to Google the Silver Pines Motel. That's when I saw it. News articles spanning decades about disappearances, reports of people vanishing without a trace. Survivors, if any, described hallucinations, shifting rooms, voices calling their names. Some never came back. I never went near that stretch of highway again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a phone ring in my apartment, an unknown number. When I pick up, nothing at first, then the same hollow, guttural voice whispers, "Room 4, waiting." No matter where I go, I can't shake it. I know it's still out there, still following, and I know that if I ever stop on that highway again, it won't let me leave. Story the end. The storm had been relentless for hours, hammering the interstate with sheets of rain that made the lines on the pavement disappear. My headlights cut narrow paths through the darkness, reflecting off the wet asphalt in a blur that made everything seem like it was moving when it wasn't. I'd been driving all day, trying to get out of the city and into the country before nightfall, but I'd miscalculated. The sun had set hours ago, and now the only movement on the road was the occasional flicker of taillights in the distance. I'd hoped to make it to the next town, but fatigue had begun to set in. My eyes burned from staring through the wipers, my hands cramped from gripping the steering wheel. I kept scanning the roadside for a place to pull over, some kind of motel or inn where I could get a few hours of sleep before resuming the drive. That's when I saw it, a faded sign, half of its letters burned out or missing, reading something like Horizon Motel, vacancy. The vacancy part glowed dimly in a sickly green, flickering like it might go out at any moment. I took the exit, tires hissing on the slick asphalt, and followed the cracked driveway up to the motel. The lot was nearly empty, save for a single black SUV parked near the far end and an older white pickup closer to the office. Puddles reflected the neon in jagged, distorted shapes. The building itself was a low, elongated structure with doors painted in peeling blue, some warped from years of neglect. The windows were grimy, curtains half closed, and the place smelled faintly of mildew before I even stepped inside. The office was small and dimly lit. A desk sat against the wall, cluttered with papers, a dusty ledger, and an old rotary phone that hadn't rung in years. Behind it stood a man who could have been in his late 60s, thin and bent, with a patchy gray beard and hollow eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. He didn't move quickly or speak immediately, just stared as if measuring me against some unspoken standard. "You need a room?" he asked finally, his voice gravely. "Yeah," I said. "Just for the night. Got caught in the storm." He nodded slowly and flipped through the ledger. "Cash only. $35. End of the hall. Room 3. I handed him a 50. He took it without a word, dropping the bills into a metal cash box with a clang. Then he handed me a key on a worn brass tag. The key was heavy, cold in my hand, and the tag rattled softly. I thanked him and headed out into the rain, my coat quickly soaked through. Room 3 was at the far end of the hall. The steps squeaked under my weight as I hurried along the corridor, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead in irregular intervals. When I reached the door, the key stuck for a second before turning, the lock groaning in protest. Inside, the room smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in weeks. The carpet was threadbare, stained in dark, irregular patches. The bedspread was floral and faded, and the mattress sagged in the middle. The window faced the parking lot, and rain streaked down the glass. A small heater coughed to life when I switched it on, sending up a faint metallic smell. The room was small, but it would do. I dropped my bag by the dresser, kicked off my soaked shoes, and sank onto the bed. I flicked on the television, an old box model that hummed as it warmed. Static dominated the first few channels until I found a local news station. The anchor spoke about a string of robberies in nearby towns, but I couldn't focus. My eyelids grew heavy, the rhythm of the rain lulling me towards sleep. I must have dozed because the next thing I knew, the room was silent. The TV was off. The storm outside had eased into a light drizzle. I opened my eyes and realized the room felt different, cold, heavy, and unwelcoming. Then I noticed something. The curtains were partially open, despite having drawn them tightly before falling asleep. My stomach twisted. I got up and peeked through the window. There was someone in the parking lot. A figure standing near the edge of the lot, head tilted slightly, as if staring directly at the window. I couldn't make out features, only the dark outline of a tall, thin person. I jerked back from the glass, heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed my phone. No service. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another guest. Maybe someone was walking their dog, though I hadn't seen any cars moving. My gut told me otherwise. I stayed on the bed, every nerve on edge, listening. Then came the scratching, slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the hall. My blood ran cold. Someone, or something, was outside my door, dragging something along the carpet. I pressed my ear to the door, hearing it move closer, then pause, then move again. It stopped just on the other side of the door. Silence. Minutes passed like hours. The rational part of my brain screamed to leave, to run. But the thought of stepping into that hall, of passing that figure or whatever was dragging something across the carpet, paralyzed me. I stayed in the room, huddled on the bed until dawn's first weak light crept through the window. When I finally mustered the courage to leave, I noticed the hall. The floor was scratched, the marks deep and jagged, running along the wall as if claws had scraped against it. My key felt heavy in my hand as I turned it in the lock, and I bolted the door behind me as I left the room. I didn't go back to the office. I tossed the key onto the seat of my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. My hands shook on the wheel, my heart hammering in my chest, and I didn't stop until I was safely out of the rain, hours down the interstate. A week later, I read a local article online. 2 travelers had disappeared at the Horizon Motel. Their room was room 3. The maid who found the room described scratches on the floor and the door, strange dents in the walls, and said she had felt an oppressive presence that made her flee without finishing her cleaning. The black SUV had been abandoned in the lot, the white pickup long gone. No one had seen the travelers since they checked in. I never returned to that part of the highway. Even now, when it rains at night and I drive past neon motel signs flickering in the darkness, I see that figure in the parking lot, feel the scratches in the hall, and remember the silence that was louder than anything I've ever heard. Story the end. The sun had long disappeared behind the hills when I found myself driving along a forgotten stretch of Route 66 in New Mexico. I had left Albuquerque late in the evening after visiting a client, and the plan was to reach Flagstaff before midnight. The road was nearly empty, the only other vehicles occasional trucks whose headlights disappeared quickly into the night. My phone had been dead for a while, and I was running low on gas. I needed a place to stop, even if it was just for a few hours of rest. Then I saw it, a small motel nestled between 2 rocky hills, its sign swaying slightly in the wind. The words Desert Shadows Motel were written in faded neon, half of it flickering on and off, casting weak light over the gravel parking lot. Only one light glowed from the office window. I hesitated at first, sensing how isolated it was, but fatigue won over caution. I turned into the lot. The office was a tiny building with a sliding glass window. I rang the bell, which echoed in the quiet night. After a long pause, the door opened and a woman appeared. She was thin, with long black hair streaked with gray, and her skin was pale under the dim office light. Her eyes were dark, almost sunken, and she spoke in a low voice. "Room for one night?" "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. $55, she replied, handing me a tarnished key with a cracked blue tag. "Second floor. Room 5. The stairs are uneven. Be careful." I followed her directions, climbing the narrow wooden stairs that groaned under my weight. The hallway smelled of dust and damp carpet. Room 5 was at the far end. The door opened easily, and I stepped inside, immediately noticing the chill. The room was small, with a single bed, a dresser, and a nightstand. The wallpaper had peeled in places, and the carpet was threadbare. I dropped my suitcase and turned on the light. The bulb flickered several times before stabilizing. Everything felt too still, too silent. I tried to shake off the feeling and went to the bathroom for a shower. The water pressure was weak and the temperature fluctuated. As I dried off, I noticed faint scratches near the bed, jagged lines that looked almost deliberate. I ignored them, thinking it was from the previous guests or the old building settling. I climbed into bed, exhausted, hoping to sleep. But the room felt heavy, suffocating. Then I heard it, the soft scrape of something moving across the floor. I froze, straining to hear. The noise came closer, circling the bed. My heart pounded. I glanced toward the corner of the room and saw her, a woman, pale and thin, with black eyes that seemed hollow. Her hair hung in wet strands around her face, and she didn't move her lips, but I felt her gaze pierce right through me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. She stepped closer, her feet making no sound, and then vanished. I scrambled out of bed and tried calling the office. My phone had no signal. The bell at the office was silent when I rang it. The footsteps resumed, slow and deliberate, moving just outside the door, then stopping. I couldn't see anything through the peephole. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I had no sense of time. The whispers started then, faint, unintelligible murmurs coming from the vents, the walls, everywhere. I stayed in bed, shivering, until the first light of dawn broke through the blinds. I ran to the office, but the woman was gone. No sign of anyone. I drove away immediately, the gravel crunching under my tires. On the next hill, I tried to find any reference to the Desert Shadows Motel online. Nothing. No reviews, no address, nothing in any travel database. I called a local historian in Flagstaff who reluctantly told me there was a motel there decades ago, burned down in a fire. Nobody survived. Some say on stormy nights, people still see the building, lights flickering, rooms open, waiting for travelers. I knew what I had experienced was real. The smell, the scratches, the whispers, the black-eyed woman, none of it was imagined. Since then, I avoid that stretch of road. But whenever I hear about old motels along Route 66, I shiver. I know they exist in a space between the living and the dead, waiting for someone weary, lost, desperate enough to stop. Even now, I wake at night hearing faint scratches along the walls of my apartment or soft, unintelligible whispers just beyond the bedroom door. I try to convince myself it's memory, but I know the Desert Shadows Motel is out there, still standing in the night, waiting for the next traveler who thinks all they need is a place to rest. And if they stop, they might never leave. Story the end. I remember that night as clearly as if it happened yesterday, though it has been years. I was driving from Tennessee to North Carolina after visiting some friends, and the fog had rolled in thick and heavy over the hills, the kind of fog that swallows headlights and makes the road ahead seem endless and unreal. My car was low on gas, my phone had died hours ago, and I was exhausted from hours of navigating winding roads. Somewhere in the distance, I saw the dim glow of a neon sign, the Cedar Grove Motel. The sign flickered erratically, buzzing faintly in the fog, and the building beyond looked like it had been abandoned for decades, yet somehow it was still standing, still waiting. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a single dark-colored sedan parked near the office. The air smelled damp and musty, like the kind of place that hadn't seen proper cleaning in years. I pulled up and got out of my car, the fog wrapping around me like a cold, wet blanket. Inside the lobby, a small bell jingled as I pushed the door open. Behind the desk sat a woman who looked far older than she should have been. Her hair was stringy, gray-streaked, and her eyes were unnervingly dark, almost black, and they fixed on me in silence. "Room?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at me, tilting her head slightly. Finally, she said, 26, end of the hall. Don't open the door if you hear whispers." I hesitated, but I had no other options. I took the key and walked down the hallway. The carpet was threadbare and damp in patches, and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead made shadows dance along the walls. Each room door looked identical, yet I could feel something different about 26. The room smelled of mildew and dust, the kind of old, heavy scent that sinks into your lungs. I dropped my bag and sat on the bed. I tried to relax, but the feeling of being watched settled over me instantly. At first, I heard nothing, only the wind rattling the window. Then came the soft whispering, so low I could barely make it out. Stay. I froze, listening. The voice wasn't outside. It was coming from the walls, the ceiling, maybe even the floor itself. Hours later, I woke to the sound of scraping across the carpet. Slow, deliberate. I sat upright, heart hammering. In the far corner of the room, a figure crouched, hunched, pale and thin. Its eyes were black voids that seemed to pierce through the dim light. It tilted its head in a way that made my stomach turn. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. The figure didn't advance, didn't speak. It just watched. Then it vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. I tried to sleep again, but the whispers persisted, growing louder, circling me, sometimes calling my name softly. When I turned to look, I could see shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls, shifting and moving on their own. I finally gave up and paced the room, checking the door repeatedly. Each time, I found the lock either jammed or unlocked when I was sure I had locked it. Morning brought no relief. When I went to check out, the woman at the desk was gone. The lobby was silent, the air thick and cold. I tried to open the exit door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose as I realized that the hallways behind me seemed to stretch further than before, twisting in impossible angles. I could hear faint footsteps and whispering from rooms that didn't exist before. I ran down the hall, blindly trying doors, each leading only to more hallways, more rooms, all dimly lit and smelling of damp decay. Some rooms had beds made as if no one had ever slept in them. Others had furniture overturned and scratches on the walls. I felt the cold presence of something following me, patient, watching. Shadows flickered along the walls, hunched figures tilting their heads at me, vanishing when I tried to look directly at them. Eventually, I found myself back at my room, 26. The door was open. Inside, the shadows pulsed, the whispers grew louder, now chanting incoherent words that pricked at the edges of my sanity. The figure appeared again, crouched and pale, eyes hollow and unyielding. I ran, but every door I tried led me back to the same room, the same hallway. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I lost all sense of time. The fog outside the window seemed to seep inside the room, cold and heavy. The whispers repeated endlessly. You can't leave. You can't leave. I tried to scream, to fight, to pry open windows, but it was useless. The building itself seemed alive, aware, and unwilling to let me go. Finally, I collapsed against the wall, exhausted and trembling. When I looked up, the hallway outside stretched infinitely, flickering lights, shadows moving in impossible ways. The figure remained in the corner of my room, tilting its head, always watching. I don't remember how I eventually got out. I woke hours later on the roadside, miles from the motel, my car parked haphazardly with the engine cold but functional. The fog had cleared, and the sun was rising. I drove off immediately, never looking back. Even now, I notice the same feeling, creeping along the edges of my perception. When I stay at roadside motels, shadows linger too long in corners, whispers echo softly from walls, and I can feel cold eyes watching me from places they shouldn't be. Sometimes I see a hallway stretch endlessly before me in my dreams, flickering lights, pale hunched figures tilting their heads. The Cedar Grove Motel, the Blackwood Motel, the Sunset Pines Motel, I know now they are not unique. They are everywhere, waiting for the next traveler who thinks a night's rest is safe. They remember, they watch, and once they know your name, they never let you go. Even years later, sometimes in the dead of night, I swear I hear the whispers again. Soft, deliberate, patient, calling, waiting. Story the end. It was late September of 2011 when I had to drive from Colorado Springs to Phoenix for a business trip that couldn't wait. My company couldn't afford a last-minute plane ticket. And truth be told, I didn't mind the drive. I liked the sense of freedom, the radio humming low, and the open road stretching across the desert. The problem was, I had underestimated the toll of driving after a long day at work. By the time I reached northern New Mexico, my eyes were gritty with exhaustion, and every mile marker felt like it was dragging. I knew I needed to stop somewhere for the night. The stretch of highway I was on was quiet, almost desolate. Towns were sparse, and gas stations seemed to appear every 40 miles or so. Just as I was about to give up and pull over to nap in my car, I saw a flickering neon sign up ahead. It read Desert View Motel, though the S in desert was half burned out, making it look like Desert View. The sign hummed faintly, buzzing in the night air. The building behind it was a low, sprawling structure, painted a dull beige that blended with the desert dust. A gravel lot stretched in front with only 3 other cars parked unevenly across it. I pulled in, gravel crunching under my tires, and parked near the office. The office light glowed harshly, the kind of yellow-white fluorescence that made everything look washed out and cheap. Inside, behind a glass partition smeared with fingerprints, sat a man in his late 50s. His skin was leathery, tanned from years of desert sun, and he had thin, gray hair slicked back. His eyes, though, were sharp, and they fixed on me in a way that immediately made me uneasy. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly, as though he'd smoked most of his life. "Yeah," I said, sliding my card through the small slot at the bottom of the glass. He didn't take it. He pushed a guest ledger toward me instead. "Cash only. $40. That was odd. Most motels took cards, but I was too tired to argue. I pulled 2 20s from my wallet and handed them over. He took them, tucked them into a drawer, and handed me an old-fashioned metal key attached to a thick plastic fob with the number 6 written in faded marker. "Room's on the left, 2 doors down from the ice machine," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "Quiet after midnight. Don't leave your door unlocked." I forced a small laugh, thinking he was joking, but he didn't smile back. His expression was flat, almost warning. Outside, the night air was cool, dry, and smelled faintly of sagebrush. I carried my duffel to room 6, noting how the corridor lights flickered like the sign outside. The door to my room stuck a little when I tried to open it, and when it finally gave, it scraped loudly against the floor. The room was exactly what I expected from a roadside motel. Stained carpet, faded bedspread with a gaudy floral pattern, and furniture that looked like it had been hauled out of a garage sale 20 years ago. The air smelled faintly of mildew, cigarette smoke, and something I couldn't place. Something metallic, like rust or old blood. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just exhausted. I set my bag down and checked the locks on the door. The deadbolt worked fine, but the chain was broken. I made a mental note to shove a chair under the knob before bed. The bathroom was functional, though the sink faucet dripped steadily. The mirror was spotted and cracked in one corner, and the shower curtain had reddish-brown stains near the bottom. I didn't want to think too much about that. After washing my face and brushing my teeth, I crawled into bed. The mattress sagged in the middle, pulling me into a dip. I turned off the light, but the neon sign outside leaked through the thin curtains, casting a faint, pulsing glow across the room. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence, broken only by the occasional pop of cooling pipes or the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. At some point, I must have drifted off. But I woke up suddenly around 2:30 a.m., my heart pounding. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I realized I had heard something. Faint footsteps in the gravel outside my door, slow, deliberate, crunching sounds that stopped directly in front of my room. I held my breath. The footsteps didn't move for nearly a full minute. Then softly, there was a sound like someone dragging their hand across my door. The faint scrape of skin against wood. My throat tightened, and I gripped the blanket, forcing myself not to move. After a while, the footsteps continued, fading toward the end of the building. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was probably another guest coming back late, maybe drunk, and accidentally stopping at the wrong room. But when I finally managed to fall asleep again, my dreams were restless and dark. The next morning, the world looked different in the sunlight. The motel seemed less threatening, though still shabby. I checked out the parking lot before heading to the office, and I noticed something odd. One of the cars, a beat-up brown sedan with mismatched hubcaps, had its trunk slightly ajar. A dark stain spread out beneath it, soaking into the gravel. Inside the office, the same man from the night before was drinking coffee from a chipped mug. He looked at me over the rim. "Sleep all right?" "Yeah," I lied. He nodded slowly, as though he didn't quite believe me. Then, without asking, he said, "Don't leave after dark tonight. Road's not safe." I almost told him I'd only stayed because I was tired and that I'd be leaving in an hour anyway, but the words stuck in my throat. Something about the way he looked at me made me feel like he knew more than he was letting on. When I carried my bag out to the car, I glanced once more at the sedan with the open trunk. The stain beneath it looked darker in the sunlight, almost black. I thought about asking the manager if he knew whose car it was, but something deep down told me not to. As I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, I caught sight of a woman standing in front of one of the rooms further down. She was barefoot, her hair long and tangled, wearing what looked like a nightgown. She just stood there, staring at me, not blinking, until the motel faded from view and view in my rearview mirror. I told myself it was just a rundown motel, filled with strange characters, nothing more. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something unfinished, like the motel itself wasn't done with me. I didn't know then that 2 months later, while scrolling through local news online, I would stumble across an article about that same motel. It had been shut down after police discovered human remains buried in the sand behind the property. The article mentioned that several guests had gone missing over the years, most of them travelers who were just passing through. The owner, the same leathery man I had seen behind the desk, was arrested. They suspected he wasn't working alone. The police never released the names of the victims, but they did say one woman had managed to escape and reported seeing others kept in the back rooms, tied up, drugged, waiting. When I read that, I remembered the barefoot woman in the nightgown, standing silently outside her room, staring as I left. And I wondered if she had been real at all, or just someone the motel had kept behind when it couldn't quite let go. Even now, years later, whenever I see a flickering neon motel sign on a lonely stretch of highway, I feel my chest tighten. I think about room 6, about the footsteps outside my door, about the scrape of a hand across the wood in the middle of the night, and I wonder how close I came to never leaving that place alive. Story, the end. The rain had been coming down for hours, the kind of steady, punishing downpour that made the interstate feel more like a river than a road. My eyes burned from staring through the wipers, which slapped back and forth uselessly against the glass. Headlights shimmered and smeared on the wet pavement, and I realized I'd been gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone pale. I wasn't planning to stop for the night, but the fatigue of driving and the pounding storm made me start scanning the roadside for any place I could pull over and get some rest. It was just past midnight when I saw the sign, flickering like it hadn't been serviced in years. Moonlight Motor Inn, vacancy, low rates. The letters buzzed in neon pink and green, half of them dead, so that it actually read something closer to Mu Ait Mot Ar Inn. But the word vacancy glowed bright red, and that was enough for me. I flicked on my blinker and turned off the highway, my tires hissing on the waterlogged pavement as I pulled onto the cracked driveway. The place looked like it had been built in the 70s and never updated since. A long, low strip of rooms stretched in a crooked line, doors painted an uneven shade of brown, some peeling at the edges. A few of the windows glowed dimly, curtains half drawn, but most of them were dark. The parking lot was nearly empty, just 2 cars besides mine, an old tan station wagon that looked abandoned, and a black pickup with no plates I could see. I pulled up to the office, a squat little structure with a buzzing light above the door that attracted more moths than it illuminated. I killed the engine and sat for a second, staring at the place. Something about it didn't feel right. The storm pounded on the roof of my car, and I realized the only other option was getting back on the highway in weather that was already trying to kill me. So I shoved the door open, dashed through the rain, and pushed inside. The office smelled faintly of mildew and cigarettes. A small counter divided the room, with a cracked plastic bell sitting on it. Behind the counter, an old television sat on a shelf playing some infomercial at low volume. The man at the desk looked up at me slowly, as if my arrival was more of an inconvenience than anything else. He was maybe in his 50s, thin, but with a gut that hung over his belt, greasy gray hair slicked back tight, and a mustache that looked like it belonged in the 70s, just like the motel. "You need a room?" he asked, voice raspy like he'd smoked for 40 years. "Yeah, just for the night. Got caught in the storm." He eyed me for a long moment before dragging a ledger toward him. "Cash only, $45. I handed him 2 20s and a 10, which he tucked into the drawer without so much as glancing. He slid a tarnished brass key across the counter. The tag attached to it said Room 12 in faded letters. "Checkout's 11. Don't lose the key." He went back to staring at the TV. I stood there for a second, waiting for him to maybe tell me where room 12 was, but he didn't look up again. The rain made the decision for me. I pocketed the key and hurried back to the car, water soaking through my jacket. Room 12 was toward the far end of the strip. The parking space in front of it was filled with puddles, so I hopped between them, dragging my bag from the trunk. The door looked warped, and I had to jam the key twice before the lock finally gave with a reluctant click. The smell hit me first, something like damp carpet and stale air freshener. The room was dim, lit only by a lamp with a crooked shade. The carpet was a mottled green with dark stains in the corners. The bedspread was floral, threadbare, and had a cigarette burn near the middle. The heater under the window rattled when I turned it on, coughing up warm air that smelled faintly metallic. It wasn't nice, but it was dry, and that was enough. I locked the door, slid the chain into place, and set my bag down by the dresser. The television, an old boxy model, flickered when I turned it on, the channels filled mostly with static. After finding a local news station, I let it play just for the noise. I went into the bathroom to splash some water on my face. The mirror was spotted and the faucet coughed before any water came out. When I bent down to rinse my hands, I noticed something odd. Scratches on the underside of the sink cabinet. Long, jagged lines like someone had dragged something sharp back and forth repeatedly. I frowned, but shrugged it off. These old places always had their quirks. By the time I came back out, the storm was still raging, hammering against the window. I pulled the heavy curtains shut, kicked off my shoes, and lay back on the bed. The mattress sagged in the middle, and the springs groaned when I shifted. The news anchor was droning about a missing woman, her photo displayed on the screen, blonde, mid-30s, smiling in the picture. I clicked the volume lower and closed my eyes. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was waking up in darkness. The TV was still on, casting a faint glow, but the sound was gone. For a second, I thought maybe I'd turned it off in my sleep. Then I realized the power had cut out. The heater was silent. The storm outside had gone quiet too. The room felt colder, unnaturally still. My eyes adjusted slowly, and that was when I noticed something. The curtains were open. Not all the way, but just enough that I could see the parking lot through the narrow gap. I knew I had closed them tight before getting into bed. I sat up, heart hammering, trying to convince myself maybe the wind had shifted them somehow. But the air felt dead, no draft, no movement. I swung my legs off the bed and moved to the window, peeking out through the slit. There was someone standing in the parking lot, a figure just beyond the reach of the broken streetlight. Motionless. I couldn't make out their face, just the shape. Tall, shoulders hunched slightly, head tilted upward toward my window. I froze, every hair on my body prickling. I stood there for what felt like minutes, waiting for them to move, to do anything. They didn't. Just stood, staring. I shut the curtain quickly and stepped back, heart slamming against my ribs. I told myself it was probably another guest. Maybe they'd stepped out for a smoke. Maybe. But something in my gut told me that wasn't it. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. No service. The little icon in the corner of the screen was empty. I paced the room for a while, trying to calm down. The logical thing was to leave, to just get back in the car and drive, storm or no storm. But when I looked at the door, the thought of crossing that parking lot, past where I'd seen that figure, made my stomach twist. So I stayed. I left the lamp on, crawled back into bed, and pulled the blanket up to my chest. Eventually, exhaustion outweighed fear, and I slipped into an uneasy sleep. I woke again around 4 a.m. to the sound of something scraping against the door. A slow, deliberate sound like metal dragging against wood. My breath caught in my throat, and I lay perfectly still, listening. The sound came again, long, slow, purposeful. I sat up, clutching the blanket, and stared at the door. The chain was still latched, the lock still turned, but the sound of someone dragging something across the surface made my blood run cold. It went on for minutes, stopping only once, then resuming. Then silence. I didn't sleep again. I sat there until the first weak light of dawn crept through the curtains. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things in a rush, shoved everything back into my bag, and opened the door. The wood of the door was marked. Faint, but visible. Long scratches near the bottom, some crisscrossing, some deep. They hadn't been there the night before. I didn't go back to the office to check out. I tossed the key onto the seat beside me, started the car, and drove straight out of the lot. My hands shook on the wheel, and I didn't stop until I was an hour down the interstate. Later that day, curiosity got the better of me. I pulled into a rest stop and looked up the Moonlight Motor Inn on my phone. There weren't many reviews, but the ones that existed made my stomach twist. Guests talked about hearing scratching at night, about shadows in the parking lot, about waking to find their doors unlocked even when they swore they'd bolted them. And one review, dated only a week earlier, mentioned something else: the missing woman from the news broadcast. The reviewer claimed she had last been seen at the Moonlight Motor Inn. The post ended with two words that still echo in my head: don't stay. I never took that road again. And whenever it rains at night, whenever I see a neon vacancy sign glowing in the distance, I think about that figure standing in the lot, head tilted up toward my window, and the long scratches carved into the motel door. Story the end. Under a pale orange sunset with streaks of red bleeding across the sky, David Jennings pulled his tired old Honda Accord off the interstate. He'd been driving since early morning, trying to make it from Colorado to Tennessee in one stretch. But after 14 hours, his eyes were stinging, and the radio static had started to sound like whispers in between stations. His phone had little to no signal, and the GPS had cut out at least 3 times in the past hour. When a faded green exit sign appeared on the right shoulder, its lettering nearly illegible under layers of grime, he didn't even hesitate. He turned off, following the cracked asphalt road that wound into a cluster of dark trees. It wasn't long before the road opened to a lonely stretch of businesses, most boarded up or abandoned. There was an old diner with windows clouded in grease, a rusting gas station with pumps long out of order, and sitting at the far end of the strip was a low, L-shaped building with peeling white paint and a neon sign that flickered Motel. Only the O and E glowed faintly, buzzing with each pulse of light. David sighed, rubbing his face. He didn't care if the sheets were stained or if the water ran brown. He just needed a place to sleep. The parking lot was nearly empty, just one old pickup truck parked crooked near the office. Gravel crunched under his tires as he pulled in. The air outside felt heavy when he stepped out, the kind that pressed against his skin like a damp blanket. Cicadas screamed from somewhere in the trees, and the faint smell of mildew carried on the breeze. The office door had a handwritten "open" sign taped to the inside of the glass, though the light above it flickered uncertainly. Inside, the office smelled faintly of cigarettes and lemon cleaner. A woman sat behind the counter, her hair done up in a messy bun streaked with gray, a pack of Marlboros at her elbow. She didn't look up immediately, just kept scratching something into a ledger with a dull pencil. When she finally raised her head, her eyes seemed a little too tired, a little too pale, like she'd been staring at something far away for too long. "Need a room?" she asked, her voice gravely, as if she'd been smoking for decades. "Yeah," David said, forcing a polite smile. "Just for the night." She nodded and slid a clipboard across the counter. "Cash only. $75. He frowned slightly. "No card reader?" "Machine's down." She didn't sound apologetic. David hesitated, but then pulled 4 20s from his wallet, setting them on the counter. The woman licked her thumb, peeled one off, and dropped the rest into a rusted tin box. Then she reached under the counter and slid over a brass key on a cracked plastic fob labeled Room 6. "Park near your door," she muttered. "Checkout's 10. Don't lose the key." As he turned to leave, she added almost absently, "Don't open the curtains." David froze mid-step, blinking. "Excuse me?" The woman scratched her pencil against the ledger again, not looking up. "Don't open the curtains," she repeated, as though it were the most ordinary rule in the world. A nervous laugh almost escaped his throat, but he swallowed it and nodded. Sure." The evening had grown darker when he stepped back outside, while the buzzing neon letters bleeding red and blue across the parking lot. His room was halfway down the row. The building's siding was warped, the paint blistered, and a couple of the doors looked like they hadn't been opened in years. His key stuck in the lock at first, and when he shoved the door open, the smell hit him immediately. Stale air tinged with something faintly metallic. Inside, the room looked exactly like every budget motel he'd ever stayed in. Two twin beds with sagging mattresses, a dresser with a boxy TV, a small table with one mismatched chair. The carpet was a faded green, frayed at the edges, and the wallpaper peeled slightly at the seams. The only thing that stood out was the curtain, heavy, dark brown, stretching across the single window. It hung stiffly as though it hadn't been touched in years. David dumped his bag on the nearest bed and sat down, bouncing slightly on the thin mattress. His body screamed for sleep, but his nerves twitched uneasily. The woman's words about the curtain clung to his thoughts. Why would she say something like that? He tried to brush it off as small-town weirdness, but every time his eyes drifted toward that heavy fabric, something in him wanted to pull it aside. Instead, he turned on the TV. Only static filled the screen, hissing loudly. He flipped through channels, but every station was the same. Dish, just snow and a faint crackle that sounded too much like whispering. He shut it off quickly, the room suddenly too quiet. The shower was lukewarm and sputtered rust-colored water for the first few seconds. He brushed his teeth, killed the light, and collapsed on the bed fully dressed. For a while, exhaustion won. His eyes closed, his breathing evened, and his body started to drift. But then came the sound. At first it was faint, like a soft tapping. He rolled over, groggy, trying to ignore it. Then it grew sharper. A knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the window pane. David's eyes shot open, his heart thudded. He sat up slowly, the room bathed in shadows. The knock came again, 3 steady thuds as if someone were testing the glass. He looked toward the curtain. It was perfectly still, heavy fabric hiding whatever was behind it. He remembered the woman's words. Don't open the curtains. Swallowing hard, he whispered to himself, it's nothing, just probably a branch or something. But there were no trees near his window, only the parking lot. The knock came a third time, louder now, insistent. He froze, muscles tense, breath shallow. Then came the whisper, muffled but close, right on the other side of the curtain. David. The sound of his name nearly made him jump off the bed. His stomach dropped into ice. He hadn't told the woman his name. Nobody here knew him. The voice rasped again, soft and coaxing. David, open it. Every hair on his body stood on end. He gripped the sheets tightly, staring at the curtain as if it might suddenly be torn open. He wanted to yell, to run, but his legs felt anchored. Minutes dragged by with only silence. Finally, gathering courage, he whispered, "Who's there?" The reply was almost instant. "It's me." The voice was wrong. Too flat, too close, as if it weren't really traveling through air but leaking directly into his ears. David's chest tightened. He forced himself to look away, curling onto the bed, pulling the pillow over his head like a child hiding from a nightmare. His heart pounded, his skin damp with sweat. Sometime during the long, suffocating hours, he drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. When he woke, the room was gray with early morning light seeping around the edges of the curtain. He sat up slowly, half expecting to see someone standing inside the room, but it was empty. His bag was where he'd left it, like the TV still black. For a moment, he wondered if he'd dreamt it. The knocking, the voice, it had felt too vivid, but maybe exhaustion had played tricks on him. Then he saw the glass. On the inside of the window, just visible where the curtain didn't quite meet the sill, were 3 perfect smudges. Oily handprints, pressed from the inside. David's stomach turned. He grabbed his bag, heart racing, and shoved his things inside without care. He didn't even bother showering, just bolted for the door. The parking lot was silent in the morning haze. The office lights were off, the door locked. The pickup truck was gone. His Honda sat alone in the lot. As he drove away, gravel spitting under his tires, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, he swore the curtain in room 6 had shifted, as though someone were standing behind it, watching him leave. But he didn't stop. He didn't look back again. And for the rest of his life, whenever he saw a flickering motel sign on the side of some lonely highway, he felt the weight of those words echoing in his head. Don't open the curtains. Story the end. The highway had been nearly empty for the last 2 hours. The kind of stretch where the hum of the tires becomes hypnotic, and you realize you've been staring at the same dashed white line for miles without a single change in scenery. I was somewhere in central Missouri, though the exact town names had blurred together after passing so many exits with faded signs pointing to gas stations and fast food places. that looked long abandoned. It was late, closer to midnight than I wanted to admit, and I was exhausted. My original plan was to make it to St. Louis that night, but the road haze had me blinking too often and drifting just slightly in my lane. I knew I couldn't risk another hour, not like that, so I took the next exit that promised lodging. The sign on the highway was old and rusted, one of those blue boards with the block letters that said Motel Vacancy. No chain name, just Motel. That should have been my first red flag, but exhaustion overrode good judgment. I followed the small county road a half mile until a dim neon sign appeared out of the darkness, buzzing faintly with the word Motel in half-burned red tubing. A single streetlight flickered over the gravel parking lot, which had more potholes than pavement. There were maybe 12 rooms total, a one-story row of doors all painted the same peeling brown, with curtains drawn shut behind every window. Only 2 cars sat in the lot. A dented old Ford pickup with mismatched doors and a gray sedan coated in dust. I parked closer to the office, which was just a small glass booth at the end of the row. The office sign was painted on a piece of plywood nailed crookedly above the door. Inside, the smell of stale cigarettes and mildew hit me immediately. A man in his late 60s sat behind the counter. His hair was thin and gray, combed straight back, and his skin had the leathery look of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. He wore a flannel shirt buttoned up to the collar even though the room felt hot and stuffy. He didn't greet me at first, just stared with small, flat eyes like I'd interrupted something he hadn't expected. I cleared my throat. You have a room?" He leaned back, his chair creaking, then pulled a ledger book from under the counter. Not a computer, not even an index card system, just a stained notebook filled with lines of names and dates. He licked the tip of his pencil before scrawling something down. "Cash only," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "That's fine," I said, though it wasn't. I hadn't carried much cash, but I had a couple of 20s left. The room rate was $40. He slid me a tarnished brass key attached to a plastic tag with the number 6 scratched into it. "Don't lose it," he said flatly. There was no small talk, no enjoy your stay, just him staring at me as I turned to leave. The longer his eyes stayed on me, the heavier the key felt in my hand. Room 6 was halfway down the row, one flickering light bulb above the door casting more shadows than illumination. The lock was stiff, and I had to jiggle the key several times before it turned. When the door creaked open, the smell inside was worse than the office, like mold covered with a layer of cheap disinfectant spray. The carpet was stained, threadbare in spots, and the bedspread was a faded floral print that had probably been there since the late 70s. A single lamp on the nightstand gave off a weak yellow glow. The bathroom was small, the tiles cracked, the sink stained with rust. I considered leaving right then, getting back in my car and pushing through the night, but my body was too heavy. I told myself it was only one night. I double-checked the door lock, noticing the flimsy chain latch barely hanging on by 2 screws. The thought that someone could probably kick the door open without much effort made me uneasy, but I shoved a chair against it for some added security. I sat on the edge of the bed, flipping through the local channels on the old box television, most of them static-filled. Around 1 in the morning, I turned off the TV and tried to sleep. The mattress springs creaked with every movement, and the sheets felt damp. But eventually my eyes grew heavy. I must have dozed off because I woke up to a noise. At first I thought it was part of a dream, but then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps outside my door. Gravel crunching, then stopping. The chair against the door vibrated just slightly, like someone had pressed against it. I froze, holding my breath. The footsteps didn't continue down the row. They stayed right there, just outside room 6. After what felt like minutes, they moved again, this time slowly along the row of doors. I heard another door creak, then shut, but no cars started, no engines revved. Whoever it was hadn't left. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat upright in bed, straining my ears for every sound. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like whispering outside, too faint to make out words, but definitely more than one voice. I crept to the window and pulled the curtain back just slightly. 2 figures stood near the Ford pickup at the end of the lot. Both men, both wearing dark clothes. One leaned against the truck, the other pacing slowly. They weren't smoking, not drinking, just standing there, occasionally glancing toward the row of rooms. My stomach turned when I realized they were looking directly toward mine. I dropped the curtain back into place and sat in silence, my heart racing. My phone barely had a signal, but I considered calling the police. What would I even say? That two men were standing in a parking lot? It wasn't illegal, just unsettling. I decided to wait it out until sunrise. But the night dragged on. At one point, I swore I heard the sound of a key sliding into a lock, too close, like at the door right next to mine. Then a muffled voice, a laugh, and silence. When dawn finally broke, gray light filtering through the thin curtains, I didn't even bother showering. I threw my bag in the car and drove straight to the office to drop the key. The man behind the counter was gone, replaced by a woman in her 50s with stringy hair and deep lines on her face. "Checking out?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, sliding the key across. She picked it up, then gave me a look I couldn't quite read. "You were in 6, huh?" "Yeah. Why?" She didn't answer, just put the key on a hook behind her and turned away. The drive out of there was a blur, and I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe the men in the parking lot were just other guests, that the noises were old pipes, the whispers carried by the wind. But months later, out of curiosity, I looked up the motel online. I couldn't find a website, but I did find a thread on a local message board. People were sharing rumors about the place, about guests going missing, about how the police had raided it once years back for drug activity. One post stood out. Someone claimed their cousin had stayed in room 6 and disappeared. They never found him, only his car left in the lot. I shut the laptop and sat there for a long time, remembering the footsteps outside my door, the whispers, the two men watching in the dark. I'd thought I was just tired and paranoid, but deep down, I knew I had brushed against something real, something dangerous. And the worst part was that no one would ever believe me. Even now, whenever I drive at night and see one of those lonely neon motel signs buzzing in the dark, I keep driving, no matter how tired I am, no matter how much I need rest, because I know what waits in places like that, and I'm not going to give it another chance. Story. The end. It was close to midnight when I pulled off the interstate, my eyelids so heavy I could barely keep the car in the lane. I had been driving for nearly 14 hours straight, my body buzzing with that sick, nervous energy you get when you've gone too far without rest. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke, and rain lashed against the windshield in wild sheets, my wipers struggling to keep up. The glowing green sign appeared out of the darkness like a lifeline. Vacancy. Pine Shadow Motel. I didn't care what it looked like or what kind of place it was. All I wanted was a bed, a roof, and a chance to close my eyes without worrying about running into the back of a semi on the wet highway. The parking lot was nearly empty. Only 2 cars sat scattered across the cracked asphalt, one an old Chevy pickup that looked like it hadn't been moved in weeks, and the other a beat-up sedan with a broken taillight. The place looked forgotten, its neon sign buzzing faintly, half the letters burned out so that it read something closer to P Ni Esh Dao Motel. The main office light was on, a dull yellow glow spilling out into the rain. I pulled up under the crooked awning, killed the engine, and sat there for a moment, staring at the building through the downpour. Inside, the office smelled faintly of mildew and cigarettes. A bell on the counter jingled weakly when I pushed the door open. Behind the desk, a man emerged from a back room. He was tall and rail-thin, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him look even longer, like his body had been stretched. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes had that sunken, sleepless look that made me think of people who worked graveyard shifts too long. His smile was polite, but didn't quite reach his eyes. "Late night, huh?" His voice rasped like he didn't use it often. "Need a room?" "Yeah," I said, pulling out my wallet, "just for the night." He slid a clipboard toward me. The sign-in sheet was old, smudged with ink, and I noticed a lot of the same names repeated across different dates, almost as if the motel had regulars, which seemed odd for a place this remote. I scrawled my name, slid it back, and he handed me a tarnished brass key attached to a heavy green fob stamped with the number 7. "End of the row," he said, his eyes lingering on me a beat too long. "Quiet down there." I nodded, gave a strained smile, and hurried back into the rain. My suitcase was in the back seat, but exhaustion beat out caution. I decided to grab it later and just get inside first. Room 7 was indeed at the end of the row, one of those single-level motels with each door facing the lot. The overhead light flickered as I slid the key into the lock, the heavy door groaning open. The room smelled faintly of damp carpet and something sour that I couldn't place. The decor hadn't been updated since the 70s. Green shag carpet, faded floral curtains, a TV with a thick back perched on a chipped dresser. The bedspread was a dull brown, threadbare at the edges. I shut the door behind me, turned the deadbolt, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The storm outside muffled everything, the heavy rain drowning the silence of the room. I flicked the TV on just for background noise, finding nothing but static and faint ghost images of channels that didn't come through clearly. After kicking off my shoes, I sat on the edge of the bed. The springs groaned loudly as if they hadn't supported a body in years. I was too tired to care. I collapsed backward, staring up at the water-stained ceiling until my eyes drifted shut. I don't know how long I was asleep before I woke to the sound of footsteps. Not outside, but above me, slow, deliberate steps pacing back and forth. My eyes snapped open. The motel was one story. There was no second floor, no attic space large enough for anyone to walk in. I lay there holding my breath, listening. The footsteps continued, soft but distinct, like someone wearing thin-soled shoes. They crossed overhead, paused, then started again. My skin prickled with a cold sweat. I sat up, straining to hear over the rain. The steps stopped the second I moved. The room felt suddenly smaller, like the walls had crept closer. I told myself it had to be the storm, maybe tree branches scraping the roof or the pipes shifting. Anything but footsteps where no footsteps should be. But as I tried to settle back down, I realized I wasn't alone. There was a faint smell now, stronger than the damp carpet. Something metallic like old coins or rust. It lingered near the dresser, heavy and sour. The TV buzzed louder, the static sharp, and then for the briefest moment, an image flickered across the screen. A face, pale and blurred, staring back as though it was pressed up against the glass. My heart slammed against my ribs. I reached for the remote and killed the power, plunging the room into silence. The rain outside pounded harder, but inside there was nothing. No footsteps, no sound, just the smell, cloying and persistent. I told myself I was overtired, hallucinating from the long drive. I forced myself to lie back down, pulled the thin blanket up, and tried to ignore the way every creak of the building made me flinch. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me under again. I woke sometime later to a different sound, the rattle of my door handle. Someone was trying it, slow and deliberate, testing the lock. I froze. The deadbolt held, but the handle jiggled up and down. Then came a soft knock, so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. After a long pause, the footsteps retreated, fading into the rain. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my eyes glued to the door, every muscle rigid. When gray morning light finally seeped through the curtains, I grabbed my bag, didn't bother to shower, and nearly ran out of the room. The lot was empty, except for my car and the old pickup that hadn't moved. The office light was off, the door locked. It was as though the man behind the counter had never been there at all. On the highway again, I told myself I'd never stop at a place like that again. But even miles away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had stood just inside that room with me, watching as I slept, and the smell. That metallic stench clung to my clothes, my hair, even though I had rolled the windows down and let the wind whip through. I tried to forget it, to chalk it up to exhaustion and paranoia, but deep down I knew the truth. I hadn't been alone in room 7, and I never would be again. Story the end. It was the spring of 2018 when I set out on a solo drive from Chicago to Albuquerque. I had recently left a job that had drained me mentally, and the idea of being alone on the open road sounded like freedom. I packed light, a backpack, a change of clothes, and enough snacks and water to last a couple of days. By late evening, I had crossed into rural Illinois. The highways were dark, and the occasional stretch of trees cast long shadows across the road. I had planned to push through until I hit St. Louis, but exhaustion hit me harder than I expected. My eyes were heavy, and the car felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I knew I couldn't drive safely any longer. As if on cue, a flickering neon sign appeared in the distance. Willow Creek Motel. The sign buzzed and hummed, letters faded and peeling. I slowed, pulled off the highway, and drove down a cracked asphalt lot toward the office. A single bulb above the entrance flickered, illuminating the sagging porch. Inside, behind a glass partition, sat a man who looked like he'd spent a lifetime in the sun. His face was leathery, lined with deep wrinkles, and his gray hair was thin and slicked back. He didn't smile as I approached. "Room?" I asked. He nodded. 35 cash. Room 9, top floor. I handed over the cash, and he slid a tarnished brass key across the counter. "Don't leave the door unlocked," he said flatly. "And whatever you do, don't go down the back hall." I tried to laugh it off, but his expression didn't change. I carried my bag down the creaking stairs and along the narrow second-floor hallway. The carpet was threadbare, patterned with stains of indeterminate age. Room 9 was at the end of the hall. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and something sweet but foul like rotting flowers. The bed was sagging, the sheets thin and worn. The TV had a thick layer of dust, and the blinds over the window were bent, letting in streaks of the neon sign outside. I locked the deadbolt and tried to push a chair under the door handle, just to be safe. Sleep came reluctantly. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my door. Slow, deliberate, dragging along the carpet. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps stopped directly in front of my door. Then came a soft scratching, as if someone or something was testing the lock. My hands shook. I didn't call out. After a tense moment, the footsteps continued down the hallway and faded into the distance. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to every creak of the building, every whisper of the wind. Morning brought little relief. The motel looked just as shabby in daylight, but there was a sense of unease that didn't leave me. As I carried my bag to the car, I noticed a dark stain on the asphalt near the back stairwell. I remembered the man's warning. I didn't want to linger, so I started the engine and drove away. Weeks later, I read a local news article about the Willow Creek Motel. It had been abandoned after authorities discovered human remains buried behind the building. Multiple travelers had gone missing over the years, most of them passing through just like me. The owner, the same man I had seen, was arrested, though whispers in the community suggested he hadn't acted alone. I realized, with a cold shiver, that the footsteps, the scratching at my door, and the strange stain in the parking lot were all real. I had been in a place where countless people vanished, and by sheer luck, or perhaps timing, I had survived. Even now, whenever I see an isolated motel on a dark stretch of highway, I feel my chest tighten. I think of Room 9, the back hall, and the man behind the counter, and I remember the sound of those dragging footsteps in the middle of the night. Story the end.